Sam Drucker watched the well-built, neatly groomed young man once again trudge past his small grocery store. Well, trudge wasn't really the word for the movement. The young man was on foot, true, but he was moving at a right smart clip, Sam thought. He moved with purpose, as if he had a mission that was time-sensitive. It was already hot this mid-July morning, and the sweat was rolling off the man Sam was watching. He and his friends were sweating slightly, just sittin' and whittlin'. Sam could imagine how much worse the young man was perspiring. Of course, he didn't really have to imagine because he would see the large wet spots on his shirt as he moved past the store. Sam shook his head in consternation. He couldn't remember when anyone in Hooterville walked as much as that man did and moved with his speed. Sam, and 3 of his friends and customers, were sitting on the rickety wooden porch watching the hot sun beat down on the already too dry grass growing up through the cracks in the wooden sidewalk. It was only 9 a.m., and the heat was shimmering up off the dusty street. It was sure going to be a scorcher. Occasionally, one of the men would say something or spit his chew into the dust before returning their attention to their whittlin' or the dusty street. When the young man came into view, they transferred their attention to him. The darkly tan, leathery-skinned young man seemed not to notice the heat or much else, but all 4 of the men sitting in the rickety old chairs knew better. At one time or another each had seen the man react to some stimulus or another, and when he reacted, he moved wicked fast. They had all been in the service during wartime and knew all about situational awareness. That young man had it in spades. He missed nothing, and they were reasonably sure he would not put up with any crap from anybody. He hadn't made many friends in town, but that was mostly because he was a loner. When he came to town on business, he was always polite and well-mannered. No one had one thing against him. They didn't know him well enough for that. Those who knew him best, like Sam, liked him just fine. The young man showed up out of the blue one hot summer day the year before and moved into the vacant Simmons house just past the edge of town. No one seemed to know where he came from or why he was there. Since property transfers were a public matter, the town soon found out the man's name was Tom Porter, and he paid cash for the old farm. The place had been for sale nigh on to 6 years, and no one locally could afford it. No one from out of town wanted to move to the small community and live in such a shack. In truth, most of the town folk at one time or another wondered why some high roller didn't purchase the small 30-acre plot, tear the house down, then build a mansion or another hotel. There were several hotels a little farther along the Tennessee River where the businessmen and well-to-do from Chattanooga stayed. They surrounded a large marina and beautiful golf course on the lake. What none of them knew was the land sold with restrictions in the deed preventing commercial development for the next 50 years. The old couple who owned the land didn't want it ruined and commercialized until they were safely in their grave. They kept 10 acres of the original 40 and built a small retirement home on it. They wanted to see their old farm the way they remembered it and wouldn't budge on the restrictions, so the land remained on the market for those many years. In fact, the old stone building overlooking the river on the back of the property was probably in better shape than the house when Tom bought the place. From time to time, someone would notice that Tom did some repair work on the old farmhouse. It was slowly being brought back to better shape. Tom was still a mystery to most, however. He walked everywhere he went around the area, but he owned an older Ford Ranger Super Cab FX4 that appeared to be in excellent shape. Excellent shape, hell. The damn truck looked showroom new. There were times when Tom was not seen or heard from for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, then all at once, he would be seen moving around his property once again or trudging around town. He was gone many weekends, or at least out of sight. When someone saw him outside and stopped to visit, he would talk to them, but they got the impression his heart really wasn't in the conversation. Now, more often than not, neighbors only waved when they saw him. He seemed to like it that way. On this day, the men watched as Tom walked, almost trotted, past the small store and into the post office. He reappeared a few moments later carrying a handful of mail and walked back toward the store. His next observed stop was the small bank. They could see him through the window as he talked to the teller, Mrs. Peters. She watched him fill out a withdrawal slip, then she counted out the requested money to him. None of that modern ATM crap in Hooterville. After Tom took his cash, he put it into his wallet, said something to Mrs. Peters, smiled and left the bank. Soon, Tom once again was back out on the street trudging along. Trudging, heck, Tom walked with a purpose, rapidly as he usually did, his hawk-like gaze missing nothing. After he left the bank, he cut across the street headed for the store. When he stepped onto the boardwalk, it creaked and the boards bowed downward from his weight. He gave the men a quick smile and said, "Morning, Mr. Drucker, gentlemen." Tom didn't slow down his steady pace as he walked past the men and into the slightly cooler store building. It, like most of the other businesses and not a few of the homes locally, was not air-conditioned. Tom was out of sight before the men's return greetings reached his ears. When Sam followed Tom into the building, he saw Tom's mail now bulging out one of his front pants pockets and Tom standing just inside the door as his eyes adjusted to the almost dark interior of the building. After his sight adjusted to the darkness, Sam refused to spend money on lights during the day, and that was that. Tom wandered around the small store taking items off the shelves. When he got his hands full, he placed the items on the counter, then walked back to the shelves for more. Tom put a load onto the counter and stood looking at Sam. Finally, Sam mentally shook himself and asked, "Will that be all, Tom?" "Yeah, guess so. This ought to be enough for a few more days. Don't know how much I need at a time." Sam tallied up the purchases and watched as Tom pulled cash from his wallet to pay. After Sam put the groceries into a bag, Tom pulled his mail from his pocket and put it into the bag with the groceries. He shrugged off the backpack he was wearing and put his bag of groceries and mail into it, then put it back on. He turned to leave and said, "See you later, Mr. Drucker." "You have a good day, Tom. Come back when you can sit a spell. And I done told you to call me Sam." "I'll try to do that, sir." "Thanks." Sam followed Tom out the door and stood watching as he turned toward his house and began walking rapidly down the side of the road. After he watched for a short time, Sam reclaimed his chair beside his friends. One of the men looked down the road at Tom and said, "There goes a real strange man. He's even stranger than that Douglas feller that bought the old Haney place." All the men nodded their heads at that comment and one of them said, "Yup. That their boy is weird as they come, I'm a-thinkin' that." The speaker leaned over and spit his chew into the dust beside the porch, then continued, "I had an ol' sow droppin' piglets coupla nights ago. I was out in the pen helpin' her out and I heard a slappin' and a thumpin' noise out on the road. My dogs begin to barkin' up a storm and run towards the road. It was just getting on at daybreak and I stepped out to see what was goin' on. There come that boy runnin' down the road and headin' away lickety-split. Heck, he was already nigh onto 3 miles from his place and still goin' away. Moved faster than scat, like something was chasin' him. Must have been half-hour later I saw him comin' back and let me tell ya, he hadn't slowed down none at all. I watched him tear on down the road headin' back to his place and he wasn't even hardly breathin' hard, far as I could tell." One of the other men looked down the road at Tom's barely discernible figure and said, "Yep. I've been seein' him around round most every mornin', too. Most days he has on that same pack he was wearing today and it looks full. He has one of them backpack things filled with water, too." After about 15 minutes of fast walking, sometimes almost trotting, Tom turned into the driveway of his house. He felt the tenseness draining from his lanky 6-foot frame as he walked down his lane. He could feel the change of temperature as he walked into the shade and down into the lower ground headed toward his house. When he walked into the shade at the road, his pace slowed to what was, for him, a slow amble as he soaked up the peacefulness of his home and cooled down from his trip to town. He still had work to do, but he needed groceries and wanted to get them before the day got any hotter, so he made the early trip to town. After he put the groceries away and ate lunch, he planned on working in his garden for a couple of hours. After that, he was going down to the river on the back of his place for a swim and to try to catch some fish. The sun should be setting about then and the fish would be biting better. As he walked, he thought about the trail he was on. He loved the way it looked and all, but he was contemplating trimming back some of the brush and trees. When he took his truck out, the limbs would slap the windshield from each side and he really didn't want to take a chance of scratching up the paint job on it. He had paid cash for it after saving almost all of his take-home pay from his first 2 years in the Army. Damn, that had been over nearly 15 years ago now. It and his little plot of ground was almost all he owned to his name. At least they were all paid for. He was better off than most people his age. He would be 35 his next birthday, even if he didn't have any furniture or a wife. When he rounded a corner in the trail, he slowed down even more and looked at his little house. It was a typical older farmhouse built in the late 1920s or early 1930s, what was called a shotgun house, because it was a long rectangular shape with 2 bedrooms on one side and the living area and kitchen on the other. If you stepped in the front or back door and fired a shotgun, you could take out everyone in the building. It wasn't typical of the old shotgun houses, though, because it was built into the side of a hill and had a half basement that exited on the downhill side of the house. At some time, the owner built a covered deck over the long side of the house and over the exit and windows for the basement. The deck overlooked a small stream or large spring rolling down the little valley toward the mighty Tennessee River that was the southern boundary of his farm. In the winter, he could see the river and one of the many TVA lakes glinting through the leafless trees, but not so much in the summer. When he stepped into the yard, he was facing the end of the house with a covered porch, the deck side of the house to the left and his garage to the right of his house. The yard was neatly mowed and there were some old lilac, crepe myrtle and japonica bushes scattered around, but no flowers. A large garden could be seen downhill along the small stream. His driveway continued past the house and along the stream, eventually ending up at the bank of the river. It passed an old stone building on a small bluff overlooking the river, then meandered down a gully to the end. It was the remains of a road that existed in old times, but was now closed and returned to the landowners. Tom walked up onto the still rickety wooden porch, opened his door and walked into the house. He never bothered locking the door. He had nothing to steal except a nice notebook computer, and he kept it in his safe when he wasn't using it because he used it for work. Other than that, he had one old recliner and side table, a bookcase, dinette table, and 2 mismatched chairs in the kitchen, along with an old cook stove and refrigerator, and his old bed and dresser in the bedroom. No other furniture graced the house, unless you counted the 2 old homemade chairs on the deck. He had sprung for an ungodly expensive mattress for the bed, but who would steal a man's mattress? He felt it was justified because a man needed a good night's sleep to function to his potential. Tom quickly put his purchases away and poured himself a large glass of unsweetened iced tea. He didn't care if he was in the South. He hated the sickly sweet tea commonly offered as a drink by, it seemed, everyone who served tea. After drinking several large swallows of the tea, he sighed contentedly, refilled his glass and walked out onto the deck to rest a moment and read his mail before he made his lunch and began his work in the garden. Tom sorted the mail and opened the most important envelope first. The return address was from the Department of the Army, although he knew it was from the National Guard. When got the envelope opened, he saw it contained what he thought it would. It was another set of orders to active duty. This time it was for a month of duty assisting a unit preparing for mobilization for a tour in the sandbox. He was to report a week from this coming Tuesday. Tom sat contemplating his career. He really liked most of the men in the Guard and Reserve as well as most of those he met in the Army, but he was sure getting tired of the stresses of his position and the deployments. He had been deployed, personally, to 3 tours in the global war on terrorism, and had an unfathomable number of shorter tours like the one coming up. Of course, the money was good and the retirement would be better when he was 60 or if he managed to add up more than 20 years active duty. Right now his total active time stood at slightly over 9 years and he still had 3 years to go before he got his 20 years guard time. In today's dollars, the retirement for him as a CW4, Chief Warrant Officer 4, with his active time would be in the neighborhood of $2,400 per month with all his credits considered. Then, at 62 he could cash in on Social Security. His retirement would be sweet with plenty of money and good health care. At present, the work was such a chore he had to force himself to continue. He planned to retire as soon as he got his good 20 years in. Unfortunately, he had no idea what he would do at that point. His only income now was his pay from the military and the short tours he took, and a little interest. He was able to live off his take-home from the Guard and the interest he earned from the remainder of the small inheritance he received when his parents died. He had almost $93,000 in long-term bonds paying about $6,000 per year interest. He lived well, but he had to figure out something to do in 3 years when he retired. He would only be 38, so would have 21 or 22 years before his pension would start. Tom let his mind rest and sat looking over his deck railing at the garden. He enjoyed the beautiful view and quietness for a moment, then his mind began thinking about the Guard once more. This month of active duty was not coming at the best possible time, but he knew that when he agreed to take it. Much of his garden crop would be ready to pick while he was gone. He supposed he would see if the Dawsons wanted to pick the vegetables. They were nice people and could probably use the produce. Their only income was their small social security checks. They had used the entire amount he paid for the 30 acres to pay off their retirement house on the 10 acres they kept. At least they were debt-free and could probably live on their small checks if they had to. Since he moved in, he made sure he took extra produce to them when he picked more than he could use. He did wish he could raise some chickens and maybe a steer or two and some hogs. Meat and dairy products really killed his budget, and he was getting tired of fish and the occasional wild game he shot. It was cheap eating though. That evening, after he finished his work in the garden, Tom walked down the trail through the woods to the Dawsons' new home instead of heading right to the river to fish. He was carrying a small bag of tomatoes and a few ears of early corn on the cob. Elijah and Carolyn were sitting on their porch enjoying the setting sun with their iced tea. Tom smiled when he stepped into the yard and started to speak when Elijah yelled, "Howdy there, Tom. Come on up here and sit a spell with me and Carolyn. You want some nice cold iced tea?" "Hello, Elijah, Carolyn. Don't mind if I do as long as it's no trouble for you. I brought you some extra tomatoes and fresh corn. It sure has been good this year already." Carolyn jumped up and took the vegetables from Tom when he got to the porch. She said, "You just sit right down there and I'll put these up when I get your tea. It's sure good to see you again. Where you been the last week?" "It's good to see you, too, ma'am. I've been around. Working mostly, and getting my exercise in, too. I have to run before it gets light enough to see to beat the heat." Elijah and Carolyn both laughed and Elijah said, "We already knowed that, son. We see you trotting down the road most mornings. How far do you run now?" "It varies, but usually about 8 or 10 miles for sure. Then I do 45 minutes or an hour of exercises and my katas. I'm usually done and ready to have breakfast by 8:30 or 9 o'clock. I work in the garden after breakfast until it gets too hot, then I just loaf the rest of the day." Elijah laughed and said, "Sure you do, son. I've seen you out clearing brush or doing other work lots of evenings, too." Tom looked sheepish and said, "Well, sometimes, but that's not really working. I'm just bored or I see something I want to change and I get on it for a while. It's more like a hobby or something." "Well, you call it whatever you want, boy. It sure looks like work to me and you sure have a heavy sweat most times I see you. Now, what brings you around here today? Not that we're not glad to see ya." "Well, I got word today I have to be gone for a month, beginning Tuesday. I was wondering if you would mind watching the place and picking the vegetables that need it while I'm gone." "Sure, we can do that. Don't have much else to do now we're retired. Just have to keep up our little garden spot and take care of the critters. Sure is nice to only have a couple dozen hens and the one old sow. Think I'm gonna buy a steer to fatten up this summer, though. Won't be no trouble at all to watch over your place." "You going to be doing anything fun while you're gone?" "Oh, I expect I'll enjoy some of the time, but I think it's going to be some long hours and short nights. Pays good, though. You said when you moved in here you worked in logistics, making sure inventories and supplies were available when they were needed and things were stored correctly. What kind of business do you work in that you can come and go like you do, if you don't mind me asking?" "It's no secret, I guess. I'm in the Guard and work out of state headquarters. I'm a chief warrant officer. I do everything from inspections to helping units set up and keep their supply records in compliance with Army and National Guard regulations. I also assist units that are being mobilized for tours of active duty. I have a unit that is being mobilized I have to assist this month." "Oh, I guess that explains all the exercising and running you've been doing. Soldiers gotta stay in shape. At least they did when I was one." Tom laughed and said, "You can say that again. I love a lot of things about my job, but sometimes I sure get tired of the exercising and other crap. I get to work with some fine soldiers, though, and that makes a difference." Tom was assisting an engineer battalion mobilize on this tour. He had some problems with them in the past because they were weak in the supply area. They had some fine young people in the jobs, but the senior sergeants were lazy and didn't stay on top of the job in two of the subordinate companies. The battalion S4, supply officer, and his crew did their best to help, but being part-time people, the job was just too large for them to keep up with everything. The full-time shop worked with the two companies, but for some reason, couldn't keep them up to snuff. Tom was of the opinion it was because of incompetent people in the subordinate units. Tom spent the majority of his time with the two deficient companies and slowly began to get their situation straightened out. The Captain S4 was a big help, but there again, he was somewhat deficient and lacking in job knowledge because he was only part-time until they had been mobilized. 3 days before the unit was to leave home station, they worked until nearly 1 a.m., 0100, before quitting. The soldiers in the supply area were then allowed to go home and told to return at 0800 the next morning. Most of the men stayed in the armory or local motels if they didn't live in town. Tom set up a cot and slept in the S4's office. Shortly before 0700 the next morning, the battalion commander awakened him. Tom had known the man almost since his first day in the guard. They were friends as well as fellow soldiers. When he came fully awake, Tom stood respectfully and said, "Sorry, sir. How may I help the colonel?" "Don't give me that crap, Tom. I've been up almost all night and I don't need any of your shit." Tom stiffened to attention, even being out of uniform, and said, "Yes, sir." The LTC, Lieutenant Colonel, sighed and sat in one of the chairs in front of the S4's desk. He said, "I've spent the last 2 hours on the phone talking about you and pulling strings, Tom. I have some bad news, and I suppose you may be pissed at me for what I've done to you, but I think it is for the best for the unit." "Oh, hell, stop standing around like an idiot and take a seat. I don't care if you're dressed or not. I interrupted your sleep and I know it." Tom sat in the other visitor's chair and looked at the commander worriedly. "Yes, sir," he said once again. The colonel rubbed his eyes, then stood and walked to the door. He opened it, stuck his head out and yelled, "Sergeant Major. Find someone to bring the chief and me some coffee, please." "Yes, sir." LTC Crockett closed the door once again and resumed his seat. He sighed heavily and said, "I hadn't much more than got to sleep last night when I received a phone call. Captain Jones had an accident on his way home last night and is in critical condition. After they stabilized him, he was evacuated to Fort Benning for further treatment. I now need an S4 for this unit and I need one yesterday. The Guard, right now, as you probably know, is woefully short of qualified officers for that position. Tom, I pulled every string I could and have approval for you to be appointed as our new S4. You will be going with us for this tour. I did manage to sweeten the pot for you, though. I convinced S1, personnel, and your normal supervisors to generate a special officer evaluation report and then send your name up for immediate consideration for promotion to CW5. Luckily, you meet minimum time and grade requirements and are eligible for consideration for a below-the-zone promotion. I was assured they would make sure the board selects you. I hate to think of all the markers I have out now because of you. I'm afraid it will take some time for the board to meet and the papers to come down, but since the board is already selected, you should be on the selection list in a couple of months. I know it is unusual for something like this to happen, selecting you below the zone and all, but you're going to earn it and you already deserve it. I even thought about trying to get you a direct commission to captain, and we may still go that route if we have to. I have already checked and you meet all the qualifications." Tom sat silently for a moment. He felt empty, then, he felt almost betrayed, angry even. Damn it, he had already been 3 times. He was sick and tired of this shit. Quickly, he got control of his emotions. Fuck, he was a soldier. A part-time, citizen soldier for sure, but a soldier and a damn good one. He told himself, shut up and soldier, soldier. He looked at his friend and now, commander, and said, "Yes, sir. Is Captain Jones going to be okay? And, I will need to go back home to pick up the rest of my uniforms and close my house before we leave." LTC Crockett smiled tiredly and said, "They think the captain will fully recover, but it will take several weeks or months. You may return home any time you feel you can take the time, but don't spend long there. We still have a lot to do before we depart." "Yes, sir. I'll get everyone busy and take off later today or tomorrow, at the latest. I should be able to make it there and back in 24 hours if I leave early in the morning." As soon as the supply section arrived for work that morning, Tom called them together. He told them about the accident and informed them he had been appointed the S4 for the deployment. After the expressions of sorrow and congratulations were dealt with, he gave assignments to his battalion shop and the supply personnel from the subordinate companies. After he was sure everything was progressing as he wished, he told his senior sergeant, a master sergeant, that he was leaving for his home in order to collect the remainder of his gear and take care of closing the place down for the upcoming year. Tom arrived home well after dark that evening and fell into bed immediately. The next morning he woke up to someone banging on his door. He pulled his pants on and stumbled to the door. He saw Elijah standing there when he opened the door. Elijah said, "I thought you was gonna be gone for a month, Tom. Are you back for good now?" "Hello, Elijah. Good to see you. Come on in. I'm afraid I hadn't gotten around yet. I need some coffee. Can I make you some, too? Don't mind if I do. I've already taken care of the garden. You want me to leave it for ya?" "No, Elijah, there's no need. I just came home for the rest of my uniforms and to clean out the refrigerator. I'm afraid my plans have changed and I'm going to be gone a year or so. One of the officers in the unit I was helping was injured in an accident and they cut orders for me to replace him. I'm going back to the sandbox again. Could you and Carolyn keep watching my place for me again?" "Of course, you can have all the garden truck. I have to pack and be back on the road as soon as I can today." "Well, sure we can. You let us know if you need anything else, son. Don't worry about things here. We'll see to it fair ye." They visited so long Carolyn got worried and came hunting Elijah. She knocked at the door, and after the greeting and an explanation to her, they visited until the coffee pot was empty. Elijah and Carolyn left for home and Tom cleaned up and prepared his home for his long absence, packed his bags and was back on the road by noon. Neither of the men thought about getting Tom's address for Elijah. The next few weeks rushed past. Not only was Tom settling into his new job, but he had to correct deficiencies in all the books and paperwork for each of the units. He was appalled at the state of their records. Much of the equipment was missing components, some of the inventory that was supposedly there wasn't, many records were either missing or completed incorrectly. He had to document the shortfalls, report them to the commander and order replacements. The commander then appointed an officer to investigate the shortfalls and assign blame for the discrepancies. Many of the people signed for the missing and damaged equipment were forced to pay for it. This, of course, didn't endear Tom to them, but it was the Army way, by the book. He became known not only as a very knowledgeable S4, but as a hard ass, also. 4 months after arriving in Afghanistan, the orders came through promoting Tom to CW5, Chief Warrant Officer 5, the highest warrant officer grade in the Army. During the evening battalion officers' call he was promoted and they had a small party for him. At the 6-month mark, the supply department of the battalion and all the subordinate companies was humming. They went from, arguably, the worst to the best and Tom found himself almost bored because of lack of work. Occasionally one of the vehicles and some equipment was damaged by enemy action, but it didn't present a problem for the S4 section. All the soldiers knew how to handle the problem and took it in stride. What they did have trouble with was when someone they knew was injured, and once, when 2 of them were killed. Finally, a year after he was called up, supposedly for 30 days, the time came for the advance party to leave Afghanistan for the States. Their job was to prepare the way for the return of the unit. Happiness and excitement rushed through the battalion headquarters and subordinate units. Tom and the remainder of the officers had some trouble keeping their soldiers focused on the task at hand. The day of departure from the theater of operations finally arrived. Everyone boarded the planes for the long trip back to Conus, continental United States. The first part of the flight was loud and raucous because of the excitement, but finally everyone was so exhausted they drifted off into sleep. Out processing at the base in the States took an almost interminable 5 days, but finally it was over and everyone was on their way home. Tom spent the night once again in the S4 office at the battalion headquarters before leaving for his home back at Hooterville. He was looking forward to returning home and just relaxing for several days before returning to a more normal existence. He had 2 months before he had to attend another meeting, and he intended to make the most of them. He wanted to put out a late garden, fish, and clean up his place. He was sure it was pretty overgrown since he hadn't been there for a year to keep the weeds cut. When Tom arrived home, he found the driveway overgrown with weeds as he expected. As his truck nosed its way down the long drive, he once again thought, "I have to trim those branches back." He dropped over the break of the hill and turned the corner where he would normally see his house. He slammed on the brakes to his truck and looked at a scene of devastation. His stomach clenched at the sight before him. His house was gone, burned to the ground. It had not been a very recent fire, either. He could see charcoal and ashes away from the foundation, but there was grass and weeds growing through them. Many of the trees surrounding the house were either dead or damaged from the fire. He could see places where the fire had tried to spread and was either put out or went out. Finally, Tom drove on into the yard, stopped and got out of his truck. He walked around the house looking at the remains with a sick feeling in the pit of his stomach. After his inspection of the damage, Tom returned to his truck and opened a beer he took from his cooler. After he drank a large swig, he turned and headed down the path to Elijah's in order to find out what happened to his house and why he never notified him. When Tom reached the house, he stopped when a large dog began barking and running toward him. He was surprised and somewhat worried because the dog acted mean. Elijah had no dog when he left and he wondered why he had one now. He was almost halfway to the porch trying to make friends with the dog when a woman he had never seen before opened the screen door and stepped onto the porch. She appeared to be in her late 50s or early 60s. After she was out of the small house, she let the screen door slap closed and looked at Tom for a moment, then said, "Rex, come." The large dog stopped barking at Tom and moved up beside the woman. The woman looked Tom over for a quick moment, then said, "Can I help you?" "Yes, I came to see Elijah. I'm Tom Porter. He was taking care of my place while I was gone. I just got back and found it burned. I want to know what happened." The woman's voice broke as she answered, "I'm sorry. Elijah and Carolyn are both dead, Tom. Come have a seat and I'll tell you all I know. Would you rather sit out here or in the house? I have some iced tea if you would like some." Tom felt as if he had been hit in the chest. First his house, and now Elijah and Carolyn. What else was going to go wrong? He said, "I'm sorry to hear that. They were fine people. If it's all the same to you, why don't we sit out here? I spent a lot of time sitting on the porch here with Elijah. And the tea sounds great. Thank you." Tom hesitated a moment and then continued, "That was always the first thing he or Carolyn said after they greeted me when I came over. They always asked if I wanted some iced tea." The woman smiled and said, "That sounds like them. They did love their iced tea and always offered some to a guest." She then disappeared into the house. After the woman returned with 2 glasses of tea, she sat beside Tom in what used to be Carolyn's chair. She wiped her cheek and said, "Oh, I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself. I'm Patricia Dawson. I came home to help Mom after Dad died and I just stayed. I don't know what I'll do now. I lost my job when I came back here and there's not much work around here. I'll have to find a job soon, but right now I guess we're neighbors." "Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking." "That's okay, I understand. I'm real sorry about your folks. How did they die?" "Well, one evening they were sitting here on the porch when they heard a bunch of loud shouts and gunfire coming from over at your place. That was about 5 months ago. Dad got his pistol and took off through the woods to check on things. After a while Mom heard more shots and then a car or truck started and took off with a roar. She kept waiting for Dad to return but he didn't. A few minutes later she saw a glow coming from your place and went to check on it and Dad. She found Dad lying in the yard dead with his pistol beside him and your house on fire. At first she thought whoever was there shot him, but the autopsy showed he died from a heart attack. Mom was never herself after that. They had been married for 60 years and she just didn't know what to do without Dad. She quit taking care of herself and then got sick early this summer and died. She's been gone a little over a month now. The doctor said she died of the flu, but I think she just didn't want to go on without Dad." "Yeah, I can see that. I don't think I ever saw a couple more in love and more caring than they were to each other. I really admired that about them." Tom sat and looked over the small yard while he thought about his friends. Finally, he turned to Patricia and said, "So, do you have any idea what happened to my house?" "The fire marshal inspected the remains and said you could get a report from their office when you got back. He left a card with the address on it. I'll find it and get it to you if that's okay." I'm not too sure where it is right now. I think he determined it was arson. There appeared to be some equipment in the house that might have been used to cook meth. He thinks a gang moved in to cook up some meth and they partied too loudly and Dad heard them. When Dad arrived and then dropped dead, he thinks they panicked and torched the place before they left. The sheriff caught 3 men driving an old truck a week later coming from another abandoned house. They found a meth lab in it when they searched it. The tire tracks matched those in your yard, so they closed the case. I'm sorry. Yeah. I just wish we had only lost the house. Thank you. I wasn't home much, but I really miss them. Do you know what you're going to do now? Not exactly. Rebuild, I guess. I didn't have much insurance, so whatever I do will be small. Oh. You can stay here tonight if you want. I know Dad and Mom would want me to invite you. Thanks, that's okay. I guess I'll just go back home though. I'm used to rougher living than this and I need to decide what I'm going to do. Well, if you need anything, let me know. Why don't you at least come over for breakfast in the morning? Okay, thanks. What time? About 8 if that's okay? I don't get around as early as Mom and Dad did. Tom returned to his place and drove his truck down the trail to the old stone building near the river. He found a spot to pitch a tent, then had a quick supper from the lunch meat and bread he had in his cooler. After that he wandered down to the stream and caught a couple of fish for his food the next day. It had been a long day, so he went to bed as soon as it was fully dark. To his surprise, except for waking once to take a leak, Tom slept over 9 hours that night, waking slightly after 6:30 the next morning to sunlight slanting through the tree leaves and birds flitting around chirping merrily. After taking his morning leak, he made a fire in an old fire pit and made a pot of coffee. While it perked, he got out one of his chairs from the truck and sat enjoying the morning and thinking about all he now had to do. It went without saying he was going to stay on his land. He did dread all the hassle he would have to go through to get his insurance money and build a place to live. He really wanted to just chill for the rest of the summer when he got home. Now, that wasn't an option. When he walked back to the fire for his second cup of coffee, he looked over at the old stone building on the bluff over the river. It was nearly covered in English ivy and looked almost like one of the old stone houses he saw pictures of in Scotland and Ireland. The windows he could see were dark holes in the building, partly obscured by the ivy. After pouring his coffee, instead of walking back to his chair, Tom wandered over to the building. He marveled once again at the construction. The walls were almost 3 feet thick and so well fitted together almost no mortar was used. Atypically, the roof was made of slate instead of wood shingles or thatch. When he entered the building through the front and only door, he stepped into a gloom almost as dark as night. What little light there was coming in the 6 small windows and the open door showed a dusty interior cluttered with years of accumulated leaves, nutshells, and other detritus left by the wind and critters. To his surprise, however, he could not see any holes in the roof or indication on the dirty floor that the roof leaked when it rained. Stepping off the building, the interior dimensions appeared to be about 24 by 30 feet. There was a large fireplace on the front wall to the right of the door when you entered the building. It even had the hardware still attached to hang a cooking pot over the flames. You could swing the pot out to stir it, then push it back over the flames. There was a built-in grate to set other pots on over the flames, also. Tom returned to his chair and sat drinking his third cup of coffee. Before he sat down, he turned his chair to look at the old building. He was sure it had, at one time, been someone's home, and a very comfortable one for the times at that. He felt a spark of excitement and a smile graced his face. It wasn't a large home by any means, but it was only a couple of 100 square feet smaller than the one that burned. He was sure he could renovate it very cheaply and have a great home once again. It might even be better than the one that burned. Yes, he was going to do it. Location was, in some ways, even better than his old house. The same small stream flowed past this house, also, on its way to the river, and there was a nice view of the river, besides. He could still have his garden where it always had been and even expand if he wanted into the old yard. He could clear the trash from the fire away and roof over the basement of the old house for a barn or storage or whatever. The resulting 16 by 30 foot building would be very useful. By the time he arrived at Patricia's house, he was very upbeat and excited. He had taken a few minutes to once again survey the old house site and was sure he could clean it out and convert the basement very easily and cheaply. When Patricia heard Tom walk onto her porch, she turned to greet him. She had been setting a table on the porch for their breakfast. She was surprised and somewhat impressed with the expression on his face. Instead of the deep sorrow and exhaustion he displayed the night before, she saw a bright, happy expression. Tom said, "Good morning, Patricia. How are you this beautiful morning?" "I'm fine, Tom, but I'm not sure I'm as good as you seem to be. I'm surprised you seem so happy after what you found when you got home yesterday." "Yeah, I was really down when I left here last night, but overnight I got some great sleep and this morning I woke up to another beautiful day. I slept in the clearing where the old stone house is and it called to me this morning. You know, it's still as solid as the day it was built. I looked it over before I came over here, and I think I can renovate it easily and cheaply and have a great little place to live. I'm going to price everything out anyway and see what the cost looks like. I even like the location better than your folks' old place." "Wow, I never thought about something like that. Do you really think you can do that?" "Dad said my great-grandfather had the place built when they came over from the old country. His father built the new place where you lived during the 1930s when he and Grandma got married. After great-grandfather died, they closed up the old rock house and great-grandmother lived in the new house with my grandparents because it had electricity and running water. That would be so cool, as you young folks say. Now, sit down, breakfast is almost ready." Tom and Patricia sat talking and eating for almost an hour before he said, "I'm sorry, Patricia, but I really need to go. I want to do some measuring and planning, then, if I have time, I want to go to Chattanooga and buy some material to begin work. I also have to get the report from the fire marshal and contact my insurance company. I need to have the place livable before cold weather, you know." "Oh, thanks for reminding me. Wait right there for a minute. I have something for you." Patricia jumped up from her chair and hurried into the kitchen. She returned quickly holding a business card, which she handed to Tom. She said, "Here is the card the fire inspector left. You can call or write them at the number and address on the card for the report." Tom stood and took the card from Patricia's hand. He glanced at it, then put it in his shirt pocket. He smiled at Patricia and said, "Thanks for the wonderful breakfast and the card. Now I have to run. I'll see you again soon, I'm sure. If you're interested, feel free to come down and check out the place from time to time." Tom never made it to town that day. He found it took a lot more time to get his measurements for the windows and the door than he expected. Then he had to decide where he wanted his plumbing and electricity placed, and figure how much material he needed. At least the electricity was part way to his new location. He planned to use the old well and pipe the water down to the new house. He had to decide how much wire and pipe he needed to get power and water from the current location to the old rock house. First, however, he had to know if he needed primary wire which the electric company would supply when they put in the line, or if he had to terminate service at the old house and use a meter loop to take the power the rest of the way. Since it was so late when he finished his measurements and parts list, Tom spent the rest of the day cleaning the trash out of the old rock house. Luckily, his old tractor started fairly easily, even if he did have to use jumper cables because the battery was discharged. He used the front-end loader on it to haul the trash away from what was to become his new house. He didn't begin cleaning up around the burned house because he was sure the insurance adjuster would want to see that before he bothered the site. Besides, it was lower priority than getting his new home completed. Tom went down to the river with his soap and a towel to bathe, then returned to his camp for a quick supper and some beer. He needed to go to town the next day for food and ice, as well as the materials. As soon as he got power to the old house, he would purchase a stove and refrigerator so he could keep and prepare his food easier. The first thing he did the next morning was make his phone calls. He called and requested the fire inspector's report, then called his insurance company. He had to explain why he was just then reporting the fire, almost 6 months after it occurred. They told him he would have to present proof he was out of the country when he filed for the policy reimbursement. His last phone call was to the electric company. They told him he would have to run primary line part way from the existing meter to the cabin. They said the distance was too far from the cabin to the old house site for the meter loop to work efficiently, but that also meant he couldn't power the well from the cabin. The solution was to place the meter halfway between the two sites and run a meter loop from the meter pole to the well and from the meter pole to the cabin. Tom spent rest of the day in town purchasing the materials he needed for the first part of his project. The wiring to get electricity from his old home site to the new one would be provided by the Rural Electric Co-op. He would have to pay for the meter loops, however. He also brought the conduit and wiring he would need for the interior of the house. He was not a qualified electrician by any means, but had helped his father and grandfather several times when they worked on wiring and construction, so knew how to do the work. Luckily, there were no county zoning regulations, so he didn't have to worry about licenses to do the work himself. The Lowe's store from which he purchased the materials would deliver the remainder of the order the following day. Included in the order were his new appliances and plumbing, as well as the lumber he thought he would need. The windows and door he would have to frame out, because some of the window openings and the door opening weren't modern standard sizes. He wasn't pleased with the way that would look and work, but it was so much cheaper than custom-sized and made windows that he chose that option. He spent a week repairing the rafters and roof decking, then replacing the roofing. After that, he spent 2 more days wiring the interior of the cabin. When he was done, he had 10 circuits and a breaker box and 200-amp service set up. He called the electric cooperative to send someone out to install the meter and the remainder of the primary wiring the next day. They would also bring and install the meter loops to hook the power to his well and new house. Tom thought he was in heaven when the power came on 2 days later. He immediately plugged in his refrigerator to begin cooling. He had it and the cook stove sitting away from the walls, but plugged in so he could cook and keep food cold once again without ice. Now he could begin working on the house because he had power for his electric tools. Before he began finishing out the window holes and installing windows, however, he had to run the water line down from the old well. He also needed to get the plumbing installed in the floors so he could finish them. He intended to put a concrete floor in over the existing rough stone floor. He contacted a heating and air company to install his HVAC and ductwork. He splurged and purchased a central unit but planned to get the majority of his heat from a wood stove and his fireplace. He used his old plow to dig the trench for his water line. It took a whole day to dig the trench using the plow and front-end loader, but he got it done. There was a little shovel work, but not a lot. The next 3 days he installed his water lines in the house and from the well to the house. He didn't have the shower, sinks and toilets installed yet, so had to cap off some of the lines. He placed faucets on the others. The next project was one he just could not do alone. He had to install drain lines, a septic tank and the drain field. He called the only person in the area that did that type of work and was told it would be 3 or 4 weeks before he could do the job. Tom remembered one of the men he was in the guard with had a backhoe, and he called him. He had not returned to work full-time after his deployment and agreed to come help Tom finish the plumbing. It took them 4 more days to install the drains, septic system, tub and shower and bathroom sink. The kitchen sink was not installed because Tom didn't have cabinets yet. He couldn't do them until he had the new floor poured and installed. By the time the rough-in plumbing and electrical was in, Tom was exhausted. After his buddy left, Tom decided to take a day off and just relax. He allowed himself to sleep in the next morning, then sat outside in the shade enjoying his coffee. After the whole pot was drained, he made a nice breakfast and ate it leisurely while he surveyed his accomplishments of the last several days. He was pleased with the progress, and truthfully, excited about the job. Even as tired and bone-weary as he was. From the accumulated stress of Afghanistan and his work after returning home, he was anxious to return to his project. Just before noon, without thinking about it, Tom found himself beginning to work on framing out his first window. He snorted at himself when he realized his day off had not even lasted a whole morning. Then he returned to work. He managed to get 2 window openings framed in that afternoon. Each window was a slightly different size, so he had to cut every board individually. To prevent having to paint or protect wood, he opted to purchase the plastic boards made from recycled plastics. He purchased a commercial sealer/caulk compound to fill in the crevices between the window frames and the slightly rough stone. The next day Tom prepared his floor to take the concrete overlay. He ordered the concrete for delivery early the next morning and spent that day working the floor, getting it smooth and level. He collapsed onto the cot he purchased to sleep in before full dark that night and didn't wake until the sun hit him in the eyes the next morning. Shortly after 8 a.m. the next morning, his phone rang. The insurance adjuster wanted to come look at the burned-out house. Tom met him at the old house site almost 2 hours later. Tom was not happy with the adjuster's attitude when he arrived. The first thing out of his mouth after he introduced himself was, "Why did it take you 6 months to report this loss, Mr. Porter? Were you hoping to let nature cover up evidence or something?" Tom felt his anger rise and heroically held it in check. He had noticed a tendency toward rapid anger since his return home and didn't like that in himself. That was just another reason he thought he needed to retire when his length of service would allow it. His eyes flashed and jaw tightened before he answered, saying, "I thought I covered that with the lady I notified about the fire. I was in Afghanistan when the loss occurred. I reported it the day after I returned home, so the length of time before the report was not of my choice." Tom pulled some papers from his pocket and handed them to the man before he continued speaking. "Here is the documentation I was told you would need on the delay. There is a copy of my orders to active duty, a copy of the orders releasing me from active duty, and a copy of the fire inspector's report. Now, do you need anything else?" The adjuster took the papers and looked them over. He relaxed somewhat, then asked, "Okay, that helps somewhat, but why didn't you report earlier? Are you trying to tell me no one told you your house burned until you returned home? I find that a little hard to believe." "That's exactly what I'm telling you. I had my neighbors watching the place. They were in their mid-80s. The man died in this yard the night of the fire from a heart attack. His wife didn't know how to contact me, even if she had been thinking clearly. She died several weeks after he did, so there was no one who could have told me about the fire." "Humph. Okay. Well, I need to look around a while. Thanks." Tom sat on a bucket in the shed while he watched the adjuster wander around the site. In about 10 minutes, the adjuster came up to Tom and said, "I've seen all I need to see. If I need anything else, I'll let you know. You should hear from the insurance company within a month or so." A visibly upset Tom returned to his building. It took most of the rest of the day for him to calm down after the insinuation from the inspector. He did get 3 window openings completed that day, however. He only had one more window and the doors to frame out, then he could install them. It took 2 days to install the windows and door, then Tom turned to the next phase of his project. He intended to leave the natural stone walls in the bathroom and kitchen, but had to seal them with a plastic-like sealer. After that was completed, he intended to build a frame inside the house and insulate the main part of the building slightly. Of course, he had to put in a couple interior walls, the ceiling, and insulate the attic space, also. This took another 10 days, but he now had R33 insulation in the attic and R6 in most of the walls. He covered the walls of the living area with an oak solid wood paneling. Now it was time for the flooring, then installation of the cabinets, and he would be done. He had smoothed out the old stone floor with concrete after the plumbing had gone in, and now he wanted to lay flooring on it. The kitchen area got ceramic tile, as did the bathroom. The rest of the house got laminate flooring. Another week shot on the floors, but the job was nearly completed. He built in some oak bookcases and a desk in one corner of the living area, and built his own oak kitchen cabinets to match the paneling. Mornings were somewhat brisk, as it was the first part of October. He still drank his morning coffee outside, but the time was coming when he would have to do it inside. He turned his attention to building a nice front porch on which to sit, then he had to gild a garage for his truck. He would delay enclosing the old basement until the spring, but he thought he could do the cleanup on nice days during the fall and winter. Most of it could be done using his tractor. When he received the insurance check on the burned house, Tom was surprised. He had the structure insured for full replacement cost and there was 50% additional for contents. He received a check for almost $150,000. Hell, he made a profit on the fire. He had spent less than $45,000 on his new house and it wouldn't take nearly $10,000 to roof over the old basement and put garage doors on it. He would have over $90,000 to invest. With his saved salary from his year in Afghanistan, he had over $265,000 saved. If he received an average of 5% return on those funds, he would make over $13,000 per year. He could retire when he got his 20 in with no problem if he continued growing a lot of his own food and didn't get sick. He could maybe find some part-time work and do fine. Shit, the insurance check was more than he had paid for the land and house when he purchased it. The next few months were unremarkable. Tom hated the holiday season with a passion. It was so lonely for him since he had no remaining family. He did make an effort to do a nice meal for the day, but hell, you can't cook a real holiday meal for one person. Well, you can, but there is a mountain of leftovers no matter how small an amount you prepare. No matter, Tom did it, then froze a lot of the prepared food. He always bought the smallest turkey he could find for Thanksgiving and had the store cut it in half so he could cook half for the holiday and half later in the year. He did up a nice ham for Christmas and had all the trimmings. Guard was going well for him. To his surprise, when he returned, he was not reassigned out of the battalion S4 position. He wasn't sure if he liked that or not. He had really enjoyed being on the state S4 staff, but a soldier does what he is ordered to do. He kept busy doing his job and made sure all his subordinate units had the best supply section possible. His time was winding down. He was down to slightly over a year until he could retire if he wanted to do so. His retirement year anniversary date was June 1st. He would have a total of 19 years in on that date and be 36 years old. Where the hell had the time gone? One of the problems with his new position was the decline in the number of days he could be gone on active duty orders. He had fewer units to supervise and less chance to pick up extra days. That not only affected his pay, it would affect his retirement when the time came. One beautiful day in early May, Tom was working in his garden, which he had expanded to almost twice the size as he had previously, when he heard an approaching buzzing, humming sound. He looked around and saw a black cloud heading his way rapidly. Oh, shit, he thought. A swarm of bees. He took off at a run to get out of their pathway. As he was running, he thought how good fresh honey would taste. After he was out of the path, he turned and watched as they continued on their way. On a whim, he took off following them. They were headed toward his old house site, so at least he could follow fairly easily as he could move down his driveway. When he got in sight of his well house, he saw the bees landing on the house and milling around. Slowly, they began disappearing. He moved closer and watched as they entered a small hole in the outer wall. They appeared to have taken up residence in the walls of his well house. Perfect. After watching the bees for a short time, Tom turned and headed for his barn and small shop therein. He spent the remainder of the afternoon working in the shop constructing a beehive. He was sure it wasn't the standard dimensions, but it would work for now. He wanted those bees and he darn sure didn't want them in his well house. The next morning early, Tom jumped in his truck and headed for Chattanooga. When he got there, he hit his favorite little bistro for a nice breakfast and coffee. While he waited on his meal, he surfed the net looking up bee supplies. He was shocked to see all the equipment he would need just for 1 or 2 hives if he wanted to do it right and not get stung. He almost backed out, but the thought of his own homegrown honey made him go ahead and make the purchases. In addition to a helmet with screen mask that tied tightly to his shoulders, he purchased a smoker to calm the bees, a set of coveralls to help keep from getting stung, and gloves. In addition, he let the man talk him into buying 2 hives and the frames for the bees to make the honey comb in. He bought wire to string the frames with and thin sections of comb to place in the frames on the wire so the bees would construct the comb neatly. He bought supers to extend the hives and frames for them, as well as tops for the hives, and even a couple of jars to mix sugar a tear in to feed the bees, if necessary. Crap, he could buy honey for the rest of his life for a lot less than this shit cost him. He even bought a couple of books on raising bees and the harvesting of honey. When he got home, Tom looked around his place to decide where he wanted to put his hives. He only had 1 swarm, so the second hive he bought would be stored in his shop. He intended to use it for a pattern to make more hives if he ever decided to expand. He knew you could use honey for sweetener, so he could stop purchasing sugar, but he wasn't sure he would do that. When he was taking the extra hive inside, he looked at the mess he built the day before. He was disgusted at himself for wasting all that time. His effort at making a hive was awful. Hell, yesterday, he went off so half-cocked he hadn't even taken the time to look up standard dimensions on the internet. That was not like him at all. He was a planner, a thinker, yet yesterday he hadn't done either. Tom decided to place his beehive in the edge of the woods in the back corner of the old yard. It would be out of the way there, yet easy to get to when he wanted to work the bees. It would be close to his garden and some other flowering plants so they could begin harvesting nectar for their honey easily. He went into his house and mixed a jar of sugar water to feed the bees until they harvested enough honey to live on. He knew it wouldn't take long, but he wanted to be safe and make sure they would stay in the hive. The store clerk told him he should keep the exit to the hive closed off for a couple of days to make sure the bees would stay. He would need to feed them during that time, at the least. Tom was waiting for evening to move his bees. Finally, it was almost dark and he decided it was time to bite the bullet. Tom suited up, started his smoker, got his tools together to take the siding off the well house and moved everything near the opening the bees were using. He let the smoker puff smoke into the hole for a short time, then began working boards loose to get to the bees. After he had a larger hole, he smoked the bees once again, then tore off more boards. Crap, what a mess! The bees had already began storing honey and, of course, the comb was a jumbled up mess. He would have to tear a lot of the wall out, remove the insulation that had honeycomb in it and rework the small building when he got the bees out. He scooped up large handfuls of bees carefully and put them into the new hive. He searched diligently until he was sure he found the queen. After the queen was moved, he moved as much of the stored honey and comb as he could, then closed the new hive. He carefully drove to its new location and placed it on the blocks he had pre-positioned. Now all he had to do was put the feed jar on top and wait for the bees to accept their new home. After moving the majority of the bees, Tom returned his tools to their proper storage places and went into his house. He spent the evening reading about bees and beekeeping. He was getting excited with the prospect. The next morning Tom repaired the well house, then, instead of working in his garden as he usually did, he built another beehive and the frames for the honey. He wanted to be prepared if he found another swarm or a bee tree. If nothing else, he could either purchase a new queen or raid his hive for one when they grew another. The spring progressed and Tom grew his garden produce and watched his bees. He also purchased 2 weaning pigs and 3 Holstein cross calves to raise. He was tired of wild game and really didn't want to spend the money buying his meat. He wanted to get some chickens, also, but decided to wait until he retired to do that. It would be easier to sell the pigs and calves if he had to return to active duty. He really missed Elijah and Carolyn. Patricia had returned to Chattanooga to find a job, so he only saw her occasionally when she came out to spend a weekend in the country. He found himself going to Hooterville more often, and even sat on Sam's porch a time or two just to visit. Amazing. That wasn't like him at all. One day in late September, Tom was working outside harvesting some of his honey when he heard feminine voices coming down the driveway. He put the new frames in the hives and closed them up, then moved away from the hives. He took off his protective clothes as he watched up the driveway until he saw Patricia and a younger version of her walking toward him. He smiled widely and waved as he said, "Hello, Pat. It's been a while." "Sure is good to see ya. Are you going to be here long?" "Hi, Tom. You're looking good. Hey, when did you get the bees? Man, what I wouldn't give for some fresh honey." "Well, you came at the right time. I just finished raiding the hives. Come on down to the house and I'll put a little in a jar for you." "No, you don't have to do that. I have been telling my daughter about all you've done to the old house and she wanted to see it, so we decided to come down and look." "You don't mind, do you?" "Not at all. Come on." "Oh, I'm sorry. Tom, this is my daughter Crystal." "Crystal, this is Tom Porter." Tom smiled and said, "Nice to meet you, Crystal. Why don't you ladies just follow me and we'll see the place? Please ignore the mess. I'm afraid I'm not much of a housekeeper and I don't have much furniture. One person doesn't need much and I've never gotten around to filling the place up." When they got in sight of the old rock house, Pat and Crystal stopped and stared. Pat said, "Oh, my. You've done a lot of work on the yard since I was here last. This is gorgeous." Crystal said, "Wow, it sure is. And your garden still looks great, too. I just love this huge porch and the swinging chairs. I could spend all day here looking down at the river and stream." When they entered the building, both women stopped again. The inside just seemed to glow. The golden oak paneling and woodwork was catching the sunlight coming in the windows just right to show perfectly. Since the insurance company paid off for replacement furniture, Tom had purchased better quality than had burned. He had a nice oak dining table and chairs in the dining area and 2 recliners with a nice oak table between them. He had even purchased a quality sleeper couch for the living area. Pat said, "This looks a lot different than it did the last time I was here. You even have furniture." She laughed when she said that. Tom laughed with her and said, "Well, yeah, but if I remember correctly, you weren't inside after I got the work done. You had already packed up and gone back to town to work." "Yeah, but Tom, this is perfect. I can't believe you have done this to the old place. Wasn't it cold in here last winter though? All that rock must have drawn in the cold." "Not really. I have good insulation in most of the building. I sealed the stone and insulated behind the paneling, and I have R33 in the attic. The only part of the walls not insulated is the south kitchen wall behind the countertops and the wall the fireplace is on. I wanted the old stone to show through there, so I left it uncovered. Surprisingly, after the stone gets warm it holds the heat very well. I mostly heat with wood, but I did install a propane auxiliary heating system. I only burned about 350 gallons of propane last winter. I do burn some along since I have a gas cook stove and water heater." Crystal said, "That is great. I hope I can get through the winter that cheaply." Pat said, "Well, you won't, but Dad's place is still easy to heat. He insulated it pretty good when he built it." She turned to Tom and said, "Crystal is going to be your neighbor for a while, Tom. She was working back east as an editor for a publishing company when she caught her husband cheating on her. She got her divorce and decided she wanted to get away for a while. Her employer agreed to let her do her work at home, so she decided to come back here and get her head on straight again. With her small salary and the maintenance the asshole has to pay her, she will do very well here, I think. I would appreciate it if you would sort of keep your eye on her, though." "Mother! I'm a 34-year-old woman. I don't need a man to keep his eye on me. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." "I know, honey, but sometimes you might need help with something, and Tom's right here. He was a great neighbor to your grandparents, and to me, and I am sure he will be to you, too. That's all I meant." Tom felt a little worried by the discord between the women. He looked toward them and said, "I would be honored to help if you ever need it. Your grandparents and mother have been very good to me, and I like to think I can be as good a neighbor to you as they were to me. If you just want someone to visit with or need help with anything, just let me know. It'll be nice to have someone close again. I never thought I would say this, but I really missed having someone living over there. I moved out here to get away from people, but with your grandparents gone, when your mother moved back to town I found I missed visiting with her. I never realized before, but when I felt the need to see someone, I always wandered over to see Elijah and Carolyn, and later, your mother. After your mom left, I went into Hooterville 2 or 3 times a month to sit on Sam's porch with the old fellas." "How pathetic is that?" Pat laughed and said, "Boy, you were hard up, weren't you? I like Sam and those guys, but I can't see sitting on the porch with them and watching the dust settle and the grass dry up." "Do they still say 2 or 3 sentences a day?" "Yeah, if they even talk that much." Now, Sheriff Haney, on the other hand. "Woohooey. That man can talk. He ought to be some kind of snake oil salesman. I do everything I can to keep out of his sight." "You think he's bad? You should have been here when his brother was around, before he moved away from Hooterville. He had an old truck and drove around instantly trying to sell something. Now he was the original snake oil salesman. If he could find a way to do it, I think he would try to sell you something you already own. Well, ladies, why don't we adjourn to the front porch and have some nice iced tea? I doubt if it's as good as Carolyn's, and it sure isn't sweetened in the pitcher, but I have some made up, and I do have a nice full sugar bowl for those of you who want sweet tea." "Why, thank you, kind sir," Crystal said. She then turned and headed for the door and a seat on the porch. When Tom came out with the tea, he brought a pint jar containing honey with the comb still in it. He handed it to Pat and said, "Here's the honey I promised you. I think I'll have a lot more than I can eat this winter, so if you want more, just let me know." The women stayed visiting until the sun dropped behind the trees. Finally, Pat said, "Tom, we really have to go. We've interfered with your day more than we should have, I know, and I'm sorry. Thank you for showing Crystal your house. You've made it into a beautiful home. I think Dad and Mom would have liked it." "Hey, no problem. I didn't have that much going on and I really enjoyed the visit. I've missed having someone close to talk to since you went back to town. You're both welcome to pop in any time you want to." The next morning Tom had his coffee on the porch as he normally did, then made a quick breakfast before he returned to his interrupted work on the honey he harvested. He only had 3 working hives, but the work harvesting the honey was becoming tedious. He knew he could purchase an extractor to remove the honey from the comb, but the good ones were expensive. He was putting the honeycomb in a colander and using a knife to break each little section up so the honey could drain out with gravity. Not only was this inefficient, but it was time-consuming and he didn't get nearly all the honey. The upside to draining the honey as he did was it was inexpensive and he could take the comb and what little honey it still contained out to his bees for them to salvage and reuse the remains. He placed the wax and honey left over after he drained what he could out of it beside the hives and the bees quickly moved it back inside once again. He knew he could sell the wax but chose not to, since he had so little and it was still partly saturated with honey. Heck, he had more honey than he could use anyway, so why worry about the little he didn't get out of the wax combs? A couple of days after Pat and Crystal were at his place, Tom was still working on the honey. He ran out of jars in which to put the honey and didn't want to go to Chattanooga just for them, so jumped into his truck and drove to Drucker's store in Hooterville. When he stopped beside the small store, he saw Sam and a couple of the guys on the porch, as usual. They all looked at him in surprise when he drove up. As Tom climbed the steps onto the porch, Sam smiled at him and said, "Morning, Tom. You must be in some kind of a hurry to be driving today. You usually walk into town." "Good morning, Sam, gentlemen." "No, Sam. I can't say I'm in any hurry. I just need some jars to put some honey in and didn't want to carry something that large back home on foot. I saw some jelly jars and pint jars here earlier this summer and was hoping you still had them." "Yep, sure do. I always keep jars and lids and such. Most all the ladies around do a lot of canning and preserving and seems like they're always running out of supplies." "How many are you needing?" "Well, I don't really know. I guess a box of each for now. I have some beehives and I need jars to put the honey in. I got carried away and don't know what I'm going to do with it all. I have 3 hives going and I can't even eat the honey I get from one. Guess I'll have to sell it if I can find someone that wants it." All 3 of the men on the porch perked up at that. Silas managed to speak first though. He said, "How much you want in fare the honey, Tom? My woman and I sure like good honey on our biscuits of a mornin'. Yeah, no local honey's better than what you get in the store. Yeah, eat a teaspoon a day and it helps if you got them their allergies." I really hadn't thought too much about it, Silas. He turned to Sam and said, "Sam, what do you think I ought to get for the honey?" "Well now, Tom, I don't rightly know. I sort of hate to see you sellin' honey here. I don't sell much but I do sell some and that'll cut into my business." Tom thought a moment and then said, "Well, I can sort of see your point there, Sam. I'm here in your business and selling something to someone else that you sell. That isn't quite right. Tell me, Sam, what do you pay your suppliers for the honey you sell?" "Well now, I don't rightly know off the top of my head. I guess I could look and see, but why do you want to know?" "Well, I was thinking you might want to buy the honey from me and sell it in your store here instead of what you buy from your supplier. That way I could get rid of my extra honey and local folks could get local honey and I wouldn't be cutting into your business." Sam smiled and said, "You know, Tom, that just might work. I think I can do that, but I really don't sell much. I don't know as if I would want a lot at one time." Sam finally decided he would take 6 pints and 6 smaller jelly jars of honey. 3 of each were to still have the comb in them. That helped Tom, but he still had way more honey than he could eat alone. He told Sam that and asked what he thought he could do with the rest. He was beginning to think he made a mistake setting more than one beehive, but hell, they were free and he couldn't resist expanding when he found a queen cell in one of his hives. Besides, he got a kick out of watching the bees and harvesting the honey. Well, Tom, I hear there's a farmer's market over to Chattanooga on Saturdays. Why don't you go over there and see if you can sell what you got left? If you had some extra garden truck, you could maybe sell that there, too. I know some of the folks hereabouts take stuff over there from time to time. You know, I just might do that. I had to get a couple of hogs and some calves to feed my extra garden truck to. I suppose I should try to sell the good stuff instead of just feeding it to the animals. Of course, I didn't get them just for that. I wanted some fresh pork and beef this fall, too. I'm going to have more meat than I can use also. Wonder where I can get rid of that. I used to give a lot of my extra garden vegetables to Elijah and Carolyn. I wonder if that girl of Pat's could use some. I'll stop by and ask her on the way home. You do that. Haven't seen much of her, but I heard she was living in Elijah's old place. Sure is sad that man of hers treated her that way. You tell her howdy for us when you see her. True to his word, Tom stopped and saw Crystal on his way home. He made sure to relay Sam's greeting, and Crystal smiled when she heard it. She said, "Sam's an old sweetie. I remember when I was little and Grandpa took me to the store. Sam always gave me a piece of candy out of the bulk jar and wouldn't let me pay. Grandpa always gave me a piece of small change before we went in, and I always wanted to buy candy, but he wouldn't take money from me. When we got home, Gramps made me put my change in an old piggy bank so I could have it later," he said. I was, I don't know, 11 or 12 before Sam started making me pay for my treats. Now, what can I do for you, Tom? Nothing, really. I was just talking with Sam and the guys about my extra garden truck and honey. They were telling me about the farmer's market in Chattanooga and suggested I take my extras there on Saturday. I remembered how Elijah and Carolyn used to appreciate getting some of my extra, and I wondered if you might want some fresh veggies along? Oh, well, sure, I guess. I don't eat much, being alone, but some fresh garden vegetables would be nice. How much are you charging for it? Nothing, for just a little to eat along. We're neighbors and I wouldn't feel right charging for something I wasn't going to use anyway. Now, Tom, you just told me you were going to take your extra to the farmer's market to sell. I couldn't take something you were going to sell for free. Well, I won't charge you for it. I was offering as a neighbor. Well, I don't suppose I want anything then. I know you are trying to live on what you make on that little place, and it wouldn't be right not to pay. Well, now, Crystal, that's not completely true. I have a little saved and I am living on that and my pay from the guard. I am going to have to find something to generate some income in a year or so, though, because I plan to retire as soon as I get my 20 good years in. I thought you got a pension from the military if you retired at 20 years or more. Why would you need to find another source of income when you retire? Won't your pension be enough to live on then? I won't be able to collect the pension until I'm 60 since I'm retiring from the guard. Well, that's not entirely true. I can start a few months before I am 60 based on the time I spent on active duty during the global war on terrorism. I don't know exactly how much earlier I can retire yet, though. Only people who retire from active duty get a pension immediately upon retirement. I won't need to make as much to live after I retire as I am now, but I will need something. I don't know what I can do to make the money, though, because I don't want to leave here for a job. Well, depending on how much you need to make, I'm sure there are several things you can do to make a little alone. Now, about the veggies. Since you won't take it free, how about taking some of the slightly damaged ones for free? That is what I plan on eating if I take something to the farmer's market. I have been giving the ruined veggies to the hogs and calves, and I still will give them the really bad ones. Would you? Like that? I suppose that would be fair. I really would like some fresh garden stuff. I didn't think about planting anything, or I might have had my own. If I'm still here next year, I might do that. Do you know anyone that could plow my garden for me? Yeah, I have a small tractor and would be happy to do yours when I do mine. On Saturday, Tom got up early, loaded his extra vegetables and excess honey, and took off for the farmer's market. He was completely sold out of honey by 10 a.m. He wasn't having as much luck with his vegetables because everyone else there was selling the same things he was. He finally managed to sell everything he brought by letting a couple purchase everything he had left for a token amount. To his surprise, he made over $300 that morning. He only brought 24 pints of honey and sold them for $10 each for $240 total. He got another $74 for his vegetables. Just as he was leaving, a man 2 trucks down from him waved for him to stop. The man walked up to Tom's truck window and said, "You the feller that sold the honey?" "Yes, I am, but I don't have any more." "Yeah, I figured. I live out west a little and have some fruit trees and garden truck. I wondered if you ever took your bees to other folks' farms to help pollinate things like some of the big-time operators do other places. I had a neighbor that had some hives, but he died and his widow doesn't want to mess with them. His hives were close enough to me they worked my place. I need some bees around to pollinate my crops if she sells out and wondered if you would do it." "Well, I never thought of anything like that. I just have a few hives, mostly for my personal use." "Hey, I could pay if that would help. I would really like to have some hives, and the widow Terrell is gonna sell those bees or just let them go," she said, "if she can't sell them. I don't have the time to mess with them and don't know beans about bees, anyway." "Well, I don't know much myself. When I decided to get a hive for my own use, I went online to learn something about it and bought some books to read, too. I was amazed at everything I learned. The honey business is way more complicated than I thought. Why people even get college degrees in agriculture for honey and honeybee production. I am still learning and taking some online courses. Well, I really need some bees around. You sure you can't provide some for me? I've been checking around and the rent is pretty high for them. I can pay a little if that's a problem. I talked to some other orchard owners and they tell me they pay over $100 a month for a hive of bees during the pollination season. Of course, I know I have to be careful when I spray so I don't kill your bees and so forth. Sir, I just don't have enough hives to do something like that. I'm sorry." "Well, you could buy Miss Terrell's hives. You wouldn't even have to move them. Alls you would have to do is collect the money and honey from em. I really haven't thought much about something like that. Tell you what, let me think about it, and if I decide to do it I can call you. What's your phone number and address? If you have it, could you give me Mrs. Terrell's, also?" "Yeah. I can do that. Wait here just a minute. I got a card in the truck and I'll write Miss Terrell's number on the back of it." While he was waiting on the man to get the information he asked for, Tom sat thinking about the proposal. He had seen references to commercial bee farming, hive rental services and so forth, but never seriously considered it. For one thing, the business looked like it was pretty complicated and the bees were subject to a lot of danger from both pests and chemicals. It would be a nice way to make a few extra dollars when he retired, though. He could begin to ramp up the business now and maybe be able to live on the income from it in a year when he retired. After Tom got home, he put his things away and went straight to his computer to begin his serious research. His head was spinning from the volume of information he found. He finally decided to sign up for another online course and found a beekeepers club that he joined. They advertised they gave classes to new beekeepers to help them get started in the hobby. While what he contemplated was not really a hobby, he thought they might have some good information for him, anyway. The next morning, Tom walked over to Crystal's to see what she thought about the proposal. He knew she wasn't any more knowledgeable than he was about bees, but he hoped it would help to talk with someone about the deal. They managed to drink a whole pot of coffee while they talked about the bees. Of course, nothing was really decided, but she did give Tom some things to think about. As he was leaving, Crystal said, "You know, Tom, this might be the answer you were looking for. It sounds really neat and you could do the work mostly at your own pace after you retire. It looks as if there is a busy season with the bees just as there is for most other agricultural pursuits, but you would have some flexibility. Renting hives to pollinate crops and selling the honey is a nice deal, too. I mean, someone else basically pays for your bees, and the honey is gravy. The largest downside I see to the deal is learning how to care for the bees and the startup costs. If you get many hives, you would have to purchase some processing equipment to bottle the honey. It takes much too long to do it like you have been doing. You would really have 3 income streams from the bees, too. You rent the colonies for crop pollination, you sell the honey and you sell the excess beeswax. Pardon the pun, but it sounds like a sweet deal to me." Tom laughed and said, "Well, we'll see. I might try it on a small scale, first, and see if I like it and how difficult it will be. I like the idea of being self-employed. I don't really like the idea of having so much to learn and the potential problems diseases could generate if they got into my hives. The rest of the week Tom spent the majority of his time learning more about the commercial side of beekeeping. It was truly a complicated field, but one he thought he might really like. Finally, he called Mrs. Terrell to discuss her beehives. When he introduced himself after she answered the phone, she said, "Oh, yes. Zeke told me a couple of days ago you might call. He really wants you to buy my husband's bees. I promised him I would wait to see if you were interested before I advertised them, but I was about to give up on you, young man. Are you interested in the hives? I would make you a good deal on the hives and all the equipment Bert had. I think I am interested in your bees, ma'am, but I really don't want to jump into deep water here. How many hives are we talking about?" I think he had 27 hives with bees in them. I really don't know if they all still have bees. I haven't looked at them all summer. He also had several hives in the barn he wasn't using. You would get them in his machinery and supplies, too, if you wanted everything. What kind of machinery and supplies are we talking about, ma'am? Zeke only mentioned the hives. I wasn't thinking about anything else, although I knew I would probably have to buy an extractor and so forth. How much were you wanting for your operation? Oh, I really don't know for sure. I was never interested in the hives or what he did. He got started as a hobby when he retired and it just kept growing. I know he was making almost as much from the bees and honey as when he was working, but that's about all I know about it. What would you be willing to pay? Why don't I come down and see what you have, then we can talk business. Would that be okay with you? I'll bring some information on prices, too, in case we decide to do business. I can come tomorrow morning if that would be convenient for you. That's just fine, young man. I'll be looking for you. True to his word, Tom found prices on almost everything he thought might be for sale by Mrs. Terrell. He was amazed when he got to her home the next day. It was a very neat older house set back in the woods. It appeared to be about 2,500 square feet sitting in a well-manicured lawn. He could see several outbuildings behind the main house. Mrs. Terrell led Tom to the largest building behind the house. It had a garage door on the front along with a walk-in door. He could also see a garage door on one side of the building. They entered through the walk-in door. Tom stood in surprise when he saw the room filled with supplies of all types. There were supers, complete hives, frames, wire, smokers, lumber, jars to feed the bees, and just about any other bee-related thing he could think of. He had no idea what some of the items were for, but he had seen most of them online. After he looked around the room a moment, Mrs. Terrell opened a door at the back of the room and said, "Come on, Tom. This is most of the supplies I was talking about." The next room was where he extracted the honey and bottled it. All of these things would go, too. Tom walked in and saw what appeared to be a 20-frame electric extractor, various collection containers, several boxes of jars and other tools to collect honey and wax. There were several racks to store filled bottles on, as well as racks holding clean ready-to-use equipment. Through yet another door they found a John Deere gator and small trailer. Mrs. Terrell said, "This was my Bert's work truck," he called it. "I know it's not really a truck, but he used it to care for the bees and haul the hives and honey around. It would go with the deal, too." Finally, they finished looking at the equipment in the building and walked outside toward the back of the property. She said, "Most of his bees are back here. He did have 10 hives over at Zeke's place and I just left them there." Tom walked carefully toward the hives. He could see bees entering and leaving all 17 of the hives lined neatly along the back fence. He turned to Mrs. Terrell and said, "I imagine the hives on Zeke's place are still active, also. I don't think I need to see them. I have no idea what all this is worth. I have a list of prices for the large items, but I have no idea what to tell you about the small parts and supplies or the gator. I found prices for new hives ranging from $179 to over $600. I didn't think to price a starter colony of bees. An extractor similar to yours would sell for about $1,500 new. I have no idea what a used one would sell for. I would like to have the hives of bees and even the extractor and bottling equipment as well as the accessories, but I have no idea what to offer you for them. Well, Tom, I really don't know what this is all worth either. How about we go into the house and have some iced tea while we look at the prices you brought with you? Maybe we can come up with something. They sat at the kitchen table with the price list. Mrs. Terrell said, "Let's do the easy things first, Tom. Now we both know none of these things are new, but they are all in good condition. Those that aren't we just won't put a price on. If it's broken or doesn't work you can just take it for free." Now, 27 hives with bees ought to be worth $200 each or $5,400. The used extractor should be worth $750 more. I know he was thinking about buying a larger gator and they offered him $5,000 trade allowance, so we'll just call the gator worth that. Now, so far, we have a little over $11,000. There are 13 empty hives in the storage room. Let's value them at $150 each. All of this large stuff comes to $13,100. How about if we just say $15,000 gets you everything to do with the bees? Now I know that sounds like a lot of money, Tom, but think about it for a minute. Zeke has 10 hives. He really only needs them for 2 or 3 months a year, but he said he was willing to pay $100 a month per hive, so you get $3,000 back from him the first year in rent on your bees. Now my Bert said most years he got 65 pounds of honey to sell from each hive. He usually sold it for $5 a pound, so that was $325 per hive or $8,775 in honey. If you can do that, you would almost make your investment back the first year. I think that's a good deal for both of us. I get a little money I don't really need, but get rid of all Bert's bees and equipment. You get a going operation and a nice little side income. What do you say? That's real tempting, Mrs. Terrell, but it really doesn't seem fair to you. And to be honest, it is really more than I wanted to spend. I don't have a good place to set up the extractor and bottler either. I would have to clean up my old house basement to use for the honey operation. I only work part-time and have a small nest egg in the bank to cushion me for emergency expenses. Well then, let's just call it a deal. I'm in no hurry for the money. I have plenty. You don't have to pay me until you take the stuff home. I'm pretty sure you should work the bees quickly though. I wouldn't be surprised if some or all the hives are going to swarm soon if they haven't already. I bet they're all full of honey, too. No one has harvested any this summer. Tom sat dithering for several minutes. He could tell Mrs. Terrell was somewhat impatient with him. Finally he sighed and said, "I may need my head examined, but I'll buy everything if I can take a little at a time as I get room for it and can move it. All I have to move things in is that little Ranger out there. It will take a lot of trips, even if I rent a trailer for some of them." Oh, didn't I mention the trailer out behind? It's only a 14-foot one, but it was part of the deal, too. It's really old and sort of beat up, but Bert used it to haul lumber and hives and other things when he needed to. He really hated to use his truck because he didn't want to scratch it up, so he bought the trailer to haul things in. I noticed the tires are flat and probably pretty well shot, but it's yours, too. Tom gave Mrs. Terrell a check for half the purchase price and made arrangements to start moving the equipment the first of the next month. He needed to clean out the building he made out of the old house basement and get it ready for his operation before he moved everything. He knew he needed to do that rapidly because the hives would need to be robbed of excess honey as soon as possible, and he had to have somewhere to process the honey before he robbed the hives. It took 3 weeks to get the building clean and the equipment moved and set up. He moved the 17 hives not on Zeke's place to 3 different locations on his acreage so they could work the neighbors' crops to collect honey. He had to shoehorn everything into the space he had, but he got it all moved and had a small amount of room to work. He could already see he would have to add on to the old basement to use for his honey operation. After everything was moved, he began harvesting the honey from the newly purchased hives. The second day he was working, Crystal walked over to see him. It was 7:30 in the evening and he was still working on the honey. She came into the building and watched as he rushed back and forth. When he finally noticed her, Tom said, "Oh, hello, Crystal. I didn't see you. Have you been here long?" "No, not long, Tom. I haven't seen you since we talked about you buying more bees and I wondered what had become of you." It was a nice evening, so I decided to walk over and see how you were doing since I felt the need for a break and some company. What is all this stuff? Well, I've been busy as a bee, you might say. I went ahead and bought the beekeeping operation we talked about the other day. I feel guilty about doing it though. I almost feel as if I stole the thing from the woman that sold it to me. The hives hadn't been serviced this year yet, so as soon as I got the stuff moved, I had to collect the honey, and now I am extracting it from the combs and putting it in jars. I'll have to make a trip to the farmer's market with it as soon as I can. If our numbers are anywhere near correct, I will have it all paid for in about 2 years, assuming I don't lose most of the bees. That fits in great with my retirement plans, too. What I make on the honey should be a little more than what I'll lose when I retire. Of course, that is assuming my numbers are correct. Crystal stood watching Tom move back and forth for a while. They talked as he did so. He spent most of the time answering her questions about the operation, how things worked, and the projected harvest of honey. Finally, Tom finished the job he was working on when Crystal came and could slow down. He moved over to a sink and quickly washed the few containers and tools he used, then turned to the still watching Crystal and said, "They're done for the evening. Would you like to come down to the house for some tea? I'm ready to sit down and relax. I've been on the go since a little after 8 this morning and on my feet most of that time." Yeah, I would. I never thought I would admit it, but I am ready for some conversation and relaxation. This book I'm working on now is The Pits. It's boring as hell, and I swear the author never took an English class in his life. Oh, come on. It can't be that bad. Why did the company buy it if it's as dry as all that? I don't know for sure. I suspect there was something going on under the table or something. I will admit the storyline is, or at least could be, interesting. The Yahoo just can't write and spell well enough to make the grade. I will admit I am being paid more for this one than normal because of all the work I'll have to do to make it flow and look better. By the time I'm done, I could have just written the book. I have to almost completely rewrite the darn thing. Really, I feel as if my name should be on the cover as co-author. Now, tell me about the honey business. What made you decide to jump into it so fast? I don't know, really. I sometimes wonder if I took leave of my sanity or something. Oh, it is sort of interesting, and I get a kick out of selling my little bit of honey I have sold so far, but even no more hives than I have now, it is turning into quite a bit of work. It won't be so bad, I hope, when I get the hives worked up this time. They were all over full of honey, and a few of them looked as if the bees had already swarmed before I moved them. All of the hives were getting ready to swarm except for 2. I have to get more hives set out tomorrow and split the hives, or I'll lose the bees getting ready to swarm. I really don't know how I'll find the time. I guess I'll just leave the honey sitting and process it after I split the hives. At least it won't spoil. Wow, listen to you. You sound like you've been doing this forever. What do you mean by splitting the hives and the bees swarming? When the bee colony becomes too large for the hive they're in, they grow another queen, and some of the worker bees and the new queen leave to form another colony. When you split the hive, you take the new queen or queen cell and move it and some of the worker bees to another hive so you can keep them instead of lose them when they swarm to find another hive on their own. Oh, how many hives will you have after you split the ones you are going to work on tomorrow? It looks as if I will have another 10 hives to make me a total of 40 working hives if they all live and don't leave after I open them up. I'll probably have to split another 10 or 12 hives within another week or 2, so I might end up with as many as 50 hives by the end of the summer. Wow. That's great. You'll be able to regain your investment even faster then, won't you? How much honey will you get from all those hives? From what I've seen in the data I've studied and from talking to a couple of beekeepers, I'll harvest from 50 to 100 pounds of honey per year from each hive. Of course, the harvest depends on several factors such as the health of the hive, the season, and availability of F. Lowers for them to work. The lady I bought these from said her husband told her he averaged 65 pounds per hive, per year. I'm being conservative and only planning on an average of 50 pounds per hive. If I do that, I'll get $12,500 gross income a year just from the honey, assuming I end up with 50 hives. I don't know what expenses will be, but unless I expand and need more hives, they will be minimal. The largest expense will be the jars to sell the honey in. That doesn't take into account any money I get for renting the hives to farmers so their crops will be pollinated. A neighbor of the lady I purchased the hives from is paying me almost $3,000 to put 10 hives on his farm for 3 months to help pollinate his fruit trees and truck garden. Wow. So if you harvest the maximum from the hives and manage to rent all them to farmers, you could make $37,500 gross. That's pretty good. How much work will you have to do for that? Really, not much. The hardest part is if I have to move hives from place to place, and, of course, when I rob the hives. During the winter I have to check the hives to be sure the bees have enough to eat, and if they don't I'll have to mix up some sugar water to feed them with, but otherwise, it's just mostly sitting around waiting for the honey to be made. Oh, I have to check the hives along for diseases and pests, but it's not a daily thing by any means. I'll still have time to do other things unless I get really big, and I don't intend to do that. My big worry now, other than losing my hives to disease or something, is how I'll ever manage to sell all the honey I harvest. I don't plan to try and rent nearly all the hives either. I won't advertise hives for rent, but if the farmer is close I might do it on a case-by-case basis. Crystal laughed and said, "Wow, Mr. Moneybags. Your big worry is how to find someone to pay you for something you basically get for free." Tom started to reply and Crystal held her hand up to stop him, then hurriedly continued, "I know it's not like that, Tom. I know you have to work to get the honey ready to sell and you have an investment in the business, so it's not really free. I also remember you saying how fast the honey sold when you took it to the market. I suspect you won't have much trouble getting rid of your harvest. I hope you're right. I would hate to have a lot of honey and no way to get rid of it. I know I can wholesale it to larger packers if I have to, but not only do I not know how to do that, I don't want to take wholesale prices for my honey. I guess I'll just have to see how things work out." "Yeah, I guess you will. Well, I need to go, Tom. I can't believe I've sat here this long. I bet you haven't had your supper yet and I've kept you from it. I'm sorry. I really need to get back to that darn book, too." Just before she stepped off the porch, Crystal turned to Tom and said, "If you need a little help tomorrow, or any time for that matter, let me know. My work is sort of like your honey operation. There's nothing I can't delay for a short time unless I have a rapidly approaching deadline, and I try not to get in a bind where I have to hurry through a manuscript. I have plenty of time to do this one I'm working on, and I think it would be neat to watch and to help you with the bees." "Okay, thanks, but I think I can handle it okay. Unless you have the protective clothes you wouldn't be much help robbing hives or splitting them anyway. The only hectic part is extracting the honey and putting it in the jars. Sometimes I could use a hand there just to make it go faster. I really don't have a fast, efficient operation there. I already know I have to add on to the basement room and rearrange it to make it more efficient." The next evening Crystal once again walked over to see Tom. She found him standing in his honey processing room looking at a shelf filled with jars of honey. He had some quart jars, some pint jars, and some 8-ounce jelly jars filled with the golden elixir. Some of each type jar had comb honey, some without the comb. She walked up beside Tom and said, "Wow, that sure is pretty. How much is there?" "This is everything from the first harvest. I got a little over 1,500 pounds of honey from the 27 hives I purchased. Now I have to get it sold. I'm going to take about half of this to the farmers market Saturday in Chattanooga to see how well I do." "Oh, that sounds like fun. You mind if I come with you? I can help with things, too." "You're welcome to come if you want, but I plan to leave about 7 a.m. And I don't know when I'll get back home. I'll leave either when I sell what I took or when the crowd dies down." "Not a problem. I'll bring my laptop, and if you don't need me I can work on that darn manuscript." She looked at the glistening jars for a moment, then said, "You know, you really need a label for the jars. What are you calling your business?" "Heck, I don't know. I guess I do sort of need a label, but that's just another expense I'd rather not have." "Well, I think you need something. I mean, use a label with your name or business name on it and your phone number and maybe even your address. You might generate some business that way. Sort of free advertising. We really need to think of something." The next morning the two friends arrived and had their display set up well before the market officially opened at 9 a.m. To his surprise, Tom began selling his honey even before the public arrived. Many of the other farmers bought honey for their personal use when they found out Tom had it. As the last time, his produce languished somewhat, but the honey flew off the truck. From time to time there were enough people milling around that Crystal would put her computer down and help Tom with his sales. She seemed to be a natural and got along much better with the people than did Tom. Many of the people would see her working and move to the line that had formed in front of her, leaving the one in front of Tom. After one rush, Crystal smiled and gently touched Tom's forearm before she said, "Tom, this is a real hoot. I love the way people mill around and buy your honey and produce. So many of them are such fun to talk to, also. I'm so glad you let me come with you. I still think you need a name for your business, though. I've been thinking off and on all morning trying to come up with one. It's sort of hokey, but the only thing I can come up with is Beautiful Gardens Apiary. We could have a slogan, a beautiful product to sweeten your day. What do you think?" Tom laughed and said, "I think it's pretty corny, but I sure can't come up with anything. I really don't care. It seems as if everything's selling okay without a label, so why bother?" Crystal said. She turned her computer toward Tom and said, "Here, look. I've even designed a label for you. I think it's kind of neat and catchy." The label showed a bee in a diaphanous negligee in a garden of flowers. The label said Beautiful Gardens Apiary, all natural raw honey, 1 Porter Lane, Hooterville, Tennessee, and Tom's phone number. Tom said, "Wow, this must have taken a long time to design. I thought you were working on your editing. I have to admit this looks sort of catchy." Another group of customers strolled up and the two friends returned to the business at hand. By 1 p.m., he was out of honey and decided to return home. He only sold about half the produce they brought. When they got home, he drove up in Crystal's driveway and turned to her. Tom said, "Thanks for going, Crystal. I really enjoyed your company and your help made things go much easier. I would have been swamped without you there to help. Can you use the produce we brought back home? I have more than I need at home and this is really too good to feed to the animals." "Are you sure, Tom? I can't eat this before it goes bad, but I can freeze and can it for the winter if you don't want it." "Fine. As long as you can use it, take it. Now, I feel as if I owe you something for helping me. How does $10 an hour sound?" "No. Absolutely not. I had fun and I asked to go with you. I won't take any pay for going. Besides, you just gave me a lot of garden produce. I'll call the trade even. Now, that's the last word on this subject." "But..." "No. Case closed." Tom sighed and said, "You're as hard-headed as your mom and grandparents. Okay, but you have to come over to my place tomorrow for lunch. I'll make the traditional Sunday fried chicken dinner and all the fixins." "Okay, that sounds like fun. I know I shouldn't, but I really hate Sundays. We always used to have some kind of family time Sunday, and now it's only me. The day is so long and boring now. I really appreciate this, Tom. What time should I come?" "Heck, I don't care. I have to admit, Sunday is normally just another day to me. I don't go to church or anything. If you go to church, come right after and I'll have lunch a little later. If you don't go to church, we can have lunch at noon. Either way, come whenever you feel like it. Heck, if you want, come down early and we'll have coffee and spend the whole day loafing." "That sounds like a plan. I only go to church on special days. If you don't mind, I'll come early for coffee. I make some awesome sticky buns. How about if I bring them to go with the coffee?" "Great. We'll make a day of it," Tom said. He opened his door and got out of the truck. As he reached into the bed for some of the produce, he asked, "Where do you want this stuff?" Crystal quickly walked to the rear of the truck and picked up a box of tomatoes, then started for the house. As she turned, she said, "We'll put it in the kitchen for now. Thanks again for giving it to me." After the veggies were all inside, Crystal and Tom walked back outside to his truck. Tom looked at her for a moment, smiled and said, "Well, guess I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks again for coming with me today." "You're welcome, again. I really did have fun." Crystal smiled at Tom. touched his arm and stepped back from the truck. As he got into his truck, Crystal started for her house. After she was a few feet from the truck, she stopped and turned toward the driveway. She saw Tom watching her and smiled. Tom looked guilty, gave her a wave and started his truck. Crystal stood watching as he turned around and drove down her driveway toward the road and his home. After she got into her house, Crystal walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of the almost sickening syrupy sweet iced tea Southerners seem to live on. She sat at the table for a moment, then stood. She gathered up a couple of knives, 2 dishpans, and a bag of the corn they had carried into the house. She carried these items out onto the back porch and placed them on the table, then walked back inside for a wash tub which she took out and put in front of a chair turned 90 degrees to the table. Crystal sat and began shucking and cleaning the fresh corn. After she had cleaned all the ears of corn, she began cutting it off the cob into one of the dishpans. She worked steadily until all except 2 dozen of the largest, most perfect ears were cut. Carolyn put the corn shucks and cobs in the back of her small truck to take to Tom's in the morning. She would leave them for him to feed to his livestock. Waste not, want not. You could feed people and animals from the same plant. After she returned from carrying the refuse to her truck, she brought out several quart Ziploc bags and began filling them with the corn. By 8 p.m., Crystal had all the corn bagged and in her freezer. She had 4 packages of 6 ears of corn on the cob and 38 quarts of cut-off whole kernel corn. Crystal quickly mixed together her recipe for sticky bun dough in her bread machine. After she had the dough started, she slapped together a sandwich and sat at her table eating the sandwich and chips while she drank yet another glass of the sweet tea she loved so much. She was exhausted but happier than she had been in several weeks. She looked at the bushel and half of tomatoes she still had to work up inside. They could wait for another day. After she finished her supper, Crystal wandered into the master bath and ran a tub of hot water for a good soak. She almost fell asleep in the tub but was roused from her stupor when she heard the bread machine beep, letting her know the dough was ready. She quickly got out of the tub, dried off and went into the kitchen to finish the buns. She almost went to sleep while she waited for the dough to rise once again. After the buns had risen enough, she put them into the refrigerator and went into her bedroom. She set the alarm to get her up early so she could bake the buns and still get to Tom's about 8 a.m. When Tom got home, he was almost at a loss. He was tired from his day but upbeat, wired. He felt as if he should be doing something, but he didn't have anything that he could do in the time he had left before it got too dark to work. He finally went to his bee workshop and worked on repairs to a couple of the older hives he hadn't used yet. He didn't get much work done, however. He found himself thinking about the day and how Crystal looked while she was helping customers and about the upcoming meal on Sunday. Finally, about 8, he gave up and returned to his house. On the way back to the house, he decided to go down to the river and cool off with a swim. By the time he got back home, he was tired enough and relaxed enough to go to bed. He had some trouble getting to sleep because he was so excited about Crystal coming down to spend the day with him the next day. Tom was up at his normal time Sunday morning, and without thinking, followed his normal schedule. He rolled out of bed at 6 a.m., did the necessaries upon arising, dressed in his running outfit and took off down his lane for his run. As usual, 10 miles and 70 minutes later, Tom trotted back down his driveway and moved immediately to his other exercises and a few katas. He was still going through his katas when he heard a vehicle in his driveway. Since it was a nice morning, he had been practicing in the shade of his front yard. He looked up and saw Crystal's truck come into sight. Crystal parked beside Tom's truck and got out. She walked over near where he was and said, "Good morning, Tom. I'm sorry I interrupted you. I thought I was supposed to come over for coffee this morning." Tom smiled and wiped his face with a towel as he walked over to Crystal. He said, "You were. I'm the one who should apologize. I lost track of time. I'm so used to exercising every morning when I get up, I just took off this morning like I normally do. I usually finish between 8 and 8:30, and I haven't been paying much attention to the clock." Tom started for the house and said, "Come on in. I probably smell like a horse. Could you give me a minute for a quick shower? The coffee should be done by then and we can come back out and sit in the shade and enjoy the morning." Crystal followed Tom into the house and watched while he put the coffee together. As he started for the bathroom, she said, "OH. I forgot. I brought the corn shucks and cobs over for you to feed your animals. Tell me where you want them and I can unload them while you shower." "Good grief, you worked the corn up after we got home last night? You must be exhausted. How long did it take you?" "Yeah, I did, but it only took a couple of hours." "You should have said something. I would have helped you. I just knocked around looking for something to do after I got home. Next time, let me know and I'll help you. As for the shucks and cobs, if you don't mind, throw the shucks into the calf lot for the cattle to eat and split the cobs between the chicken coop and the pig pen." "Oh, heck, it won't take long. Come on, I'll help you." "No. It's not that hard and I can do it for you. Now go on and get your shower." Tom allowed Crystal to convince him to clean up and went grudgingly to do so. To his surprise, when he came out dressed in a better than normal summer outfit of shorts and button-front shirt, he found Crystal coming in the door with a large pan of wonderful smelling, still warm from the oven, sticky rolls. She undulated into his kitchen and he stood admiring the rear view. She placed the pan of rolls on his granite countertop beside the coffee pot and turned to ask where the cups and plates were. She smiled when she saw Tom watching her. She let him look for a moment, then asked, "Where are the cups, plates, and silverware, Tom?" Tom came to himself with a start and moved toward Crystal. As he neared her, he said, "The cups and dishes are in the cabinet over the coffee. I'll get the forks." Crystal dished up 2 rolls onto each plate, filled 2 large mugs with coffee and stood while Tom put a fork on each plate. He asked, "Do you need cream or sugar for the coffee?" "Nope, just like it comes from the pot for me." "Great. Come on, let's go outside and enjoy the morning while we have our coffee." Tom started for the door, then stopped and returned to the kitchen. When Crystal realized he wasn't following her, she turned in time to see him put his plate and cup on the counter and open the refrigerator freezer. He took a package from the freezer and put it in the sink, then picked up his rolls and coffee. Crystal watched as Tom moved toward her before giving a little shake and turning toward the door once again. When he got closer to Crystal, Tom said, "I almost forgot to get the chicken out to thaw. We'll sit and visit a while, then I need to come in and peel the potatoes and get things ready to cook. I'm really looking forward to lunch today. This is one of my favorite meals and I know it'll taste better just because I have company to eat it with. Special meals always taste better with guests." Crystal smiled and said, "I'm glad. I have to admit, there's not much better than a home fried chicken dinner, and, you're right, it's even better with someone to enjoy it with you." After they were settled into chairs, Tom took his first bite of the roll. He sipped his coffee and turned to Crystal. "Crystal, these are excellent rolls. I'm sure glad you brought them." "Thanks." "You're welcome," Crystal said. The couple then sat in companionable silence as they ate, drank their coffee and looked over the yard toward the river. The constant tinkle of the small stream chuckling around and over the rocks as it flowed toward the river made a pleasant background noise, as did the chirping of the many birds flitting from place to place. After an indeterminate period of time, Crystal turned toward Tom and said, "This is just perfect. I could spend hours just sitting here with you and enjoying the solitude. And thank you again for yesterday. I really enjoyed getting out and I had fun selling your produce. Yeah, I sometimes have to force myself to go back to work after a break here. I totally love it here. I'm almost glad my other house burned. I like this one much better." After they finished the pot of coffee, Tom got up, took their dishes into the house and returned with a bag of potatoes, half-dozen ears of corn and a tomato. He returned to the house and came out with 2 pans, a sharp knife and a bucket. He sat down beside the table and began working on lunch preparation. When she saw what he was doing, Crystal got up and went into the kitchen. She quickly got a knife out of the drawer and returned to help Tom. Since Tom was working on the corn, Crystal grabbed a potato and began peeling it. She asked, "How many potatoes do we need, Tom?" "You don't have to do that, Crystal. I invited you for lunch, not to help cook it." "Well, I'm going to do it. Now, how many potatoes do you want me to do?" "No larger than they are, do 6. When I cook I always make more than I can eat, so I have leftovers for a day or 2 so I don't have to cook as often." Crystal laughed and said, "You too?" That's great. I do, too. They quickly go. The preparation completed and Tom took the peelings and corn shucks out to the livestock. By the time he returned, Crystal had everything in the house. Tom looked at the clock and saw it was only 11 a.m. He said, "It's not quite time to cook yet. Why don't we sit outside for a while longer?" When he began preparing the meal, Crystal tried to help, but Tom gently pushed her into the living area and made her sit and watch. As he said, "There's really not much left to do. All I have to do is turn the chicken every so often and let the food cook." To her surprise, the meal was on the table at precisely noon and was delicious. They ate more than either of them normally would, then cleaned up the mess. Tom said, "Why don't we sit outside again and let this settle?" After they had been sitting for a few minutes, Tom said, "How would you like to walk down to the river? I either have to move or I'm going to go to sleep." Crystal laughed and said, "Me too. Aren't we a fine pair?" Without thinking, she stood, held her hand out toward Tom and said, "Well, come on." Tom took her hand and they headed off. They were almost all the way across the yard when they both seemed to realize at the same time they were holding hands. Tom looked over at Crystal almost at the same time she looked down toward where their hands were joined. They let go of each other's hand and moved a few inches farther apart as they continued on their walk. Before they were to the river, Crystal felt something brush her side and looked over to see Tom walking closely beside her. Once again, without thinking, she smiled and took his hand. Tom looked down at their once again joined hands, then up at Crystal's face. He gently squeezed her hand and this time left them joined. Before they reached the river, Crystal was leaning slightly into Tom as they walked hip to hip. When they reached the river, they sat on a rock in a mowed grassy area. The rock was just the right height to serve as a fine seat. They sat and talked for a while as they watched the river flow and an occasional boat move past. Finally, Crystal stood and said, "Tom, I've had a lot of fun, but I really need to get home. I want to can the tomatoes today and I have to get back to work on that damn manuscript before I get into a bind." Tom stood, and this time he took Crystal's hand as they turned and walked back up the trail to his house. They walked straight to Crystal's truck and stood almost nose to nose for a moment. With a sigh, Crystal stepped back and opened her truck door. She looked Tom in the face and said, "Thanks again for today, Tom. You'll have to come to my place next time. Now, I've really got to go." Tom stood and watched until Crystal was out of sight, then he returned to his house. When he went inside, he saw her pan and the remaining rolls on the cabinet. He went to the bathroom, then decided to take the pan and rolls back so she would have them for her breakfast the next morning. Within 30 minutes of her leaving, Tom was walking up on Crystal's back porch. He stood in the screen door looking into her kitchen and saw her already blanching tomatoes in preparation of peeling and coring them before she canned them. Crystal jumped when she heard Tom knock on her door and say, "You forgot your pan and rolls, so I brought them over, Crystal." Crystal looked at Tom, smiled and quickly dried off her hands. She said, "Well, come on in. Just put them on the table." Tom looked at the boxes of tomatoes and said, "Let me help you, Crystal. I don't have anything I have to do and you don't need to do all this by yourself." "Oh, I couldn't do that. Why don't you just sit and talk while I finish up here?" Tom snorted and said, "It doesn't look to me like you've much more than started. You're nowhere near finishing. Why don't you blanch and I'll peel and core? We'll be done in no time." Tom grabbed the knife from the cabinet beside Crystal, took the pan of already blanched tomatoes, then moved to the side. He looked around and said, "Where are the jars you were going to put these in? I can cut them and put them into the jars when I peel them. They're still in the dishwasher. I ran it while I was at your place." Tom moved to the dishwasher and pulled the jars from it. He placed them on the cabinet beside where he was going to work and began peeling tomatoes, quartering them and placing them in the quart canning jars. Crystal continued blanching the tomatoes so the skins would slip off with just a touch, making the peeling much easier. By the time she had all of the tomatoes blanched, Tom had 14 quarts in jars. Crystal quickly wiped off the tops of 7 jars and placed lids on them before putting them in her pressure canner on the stove. As it was building up pressure, she began helping Tom peel and jar the remaining tomatoes. By the time the first pressure canner load was ready to take out, the two friends had all the tomatoes in jars ready to pressure can. They had 39 quarts of tomatoes, total. Tom stayed until the canning was done. While the canner was building up and letting off pressure, they cleaned the kitchen and pots and pans used in canning. When the job was done, the cabinet was covered in freshly canned jars of beautiful red and yellow tomatoes. Tom walked over to the table and pulled a chair out. He sat in the chair and let out a whoosh, then said, "Phew, that was a job. I haven't canned anything since before Mom died. I love home canned green beans and tomatoes, but I haven't taken the time to do it since I moved out here. I just freeze a little corn and buy most of my other things. I think I'll buy a canner and some more jars and can some tomatoes and beans this year." Crystal smiled at Tom and said, "Yeah, it's a little work, but the food is so much better it's worth it." She opened the refrigerator, grabbed the tea pitcher and poured them each a glass. She handed Tom his and headed for the door. As she pushed open the screen door, she turned to Tom and said, "Come on, let's sit on the porch where it's cooler to drink our tea." Crystal looked at an old clock on the porch wall and smiled. She turned to Tom and said, "Thanks so much for your help. I can't believe we're already done. It's just barely after 7 and I thought I would be working until 10 or 11 before I got done. You don't know how much I appreciate this, Tom." "You're welcome, and yes, I think I do know how much you appreciate this. I used to help Mom, and I remember how tiring canning days were. Well, any day we froze, canned, or preserved things. I hated it then, but I sort of enjoyed helping you today." They visited a few minutes, then Tom's stomach growled. Crystal looked over at Tom and said, "Oh, I'm sorry. You must be starved." "I know I am. Let me go see what I have to eat. I think all I have that is quick will be sandwiches and chips, or I can heat up a can of soup." "Yeah, I am hungry, but there's no reason for you to make a meal. I know you're exhausted. Why don't we go back to my place and we'll eat the leftovers from lunch?" "I couldn't do that, Tom. It wouldn't be right. Come on in. I'll find something." "Nope, not gonna happen. Come on. It's no bother and we both need a good meal." Tom reached out and grabbed Crystal's hand. He pulled gently until she sighed and stood. He kept her hand and pulled her down the steps and toward the path to his place. When they got to Tom's house, he went straight to the refrigerator and began pulling containers of lunch leftovers out. The items in pans he put on the stove and turned on the burners under them. The other items, he loosened the covers on and placed in the microwave for heating. While he was doing that, Crystal moved to the cabinet and set the table. Within 10 minutes they were sitting at the table eating. Almost the only noise heard was the clinking of eating utensils against china. When she was almost done, Crystal looked over at Tom and said, "This is just as good now as it was at noon. Thank you for letting me eat here. I'm not sure I even had the strength to heat a can of soup. I would probably only have had a sandwich for supper." "No problem, Chris. I enjoy having you and it was the least I could do for you." "Chris? Oh, I'm sorry, Crystal. I didn't mean to upset you. That just slipped out." "No, that's okay. No one's ever called me Chris before. They just usually call me Chrissy or by my full name. And as to the meal, what do you mean it's the least you could do for me? You didn't owe me anything. If anything, I owe you for helping me this afternoon. Well, I kept you from your work after lunch and I was the one that saddled you with all those tomatoes. I just felt as if I should help get rid of them." After the meal, Crystal helped clean up once again and then headed for the door. She said, "Tom, I hate to eat and run, but I really need to go. I'm exhausted and I really have to get up early tomorrow and work on that manuscript. I'd love to sit and talk some more, but it's almost 8:30 p.m. I'll see you later. I'll bring the peelings and trash from the tomatoes over tomorrow for the livestock." Tom started toward the door and flipped on the yard light that was on a switch instead of an electric eye. He followed Crystal out and walked beside her as she started toward her home. She said, "Tom, you don't have to walk me home, you know. I'll be fine." "Well, maybe I don't have to walk you home, but I'm going to. That way I'll know you're all right." When they got to Crystal's house, Tom didn't go inside. He waited until she had some lights on and he heard the door lock, then turned and returned to his house. The next morning Tom was in his shower when he heard a vehicle in his drive. He rushed through his morning ablutions and dressed. When he went outside, he found Crystal on the porch. She smiled when she saw him and stood. "Crystal! What are you doing here? I thought you had to work on your manuscript this morning." "I did. I do, but I was put ting the tomatoes away before I started on it and decided since you grew them and helped can them you should have some of them, so I brought some of them and some of the corn down for you and I brought the garbage for the animals at the same time. Besides, there's no way I can eat all those tomatoes and the corn by myself. Now, where do you want them? And will you help me unload so I can get to work?" "You didn't have to do that." "Maybe not, but I did. Now, where do you want them?" Inside I guess. The freezer is in the utility room I built on behind the house and I'll put the tomatoes in one of the cabinets in the kitchen." They quickly brought the food inside and set it on the table until Tom could make room for it. He looked at the jars and packages on his table and said, "You brought half of what we canned. Why did you do that?" "I told you. Fair's fair. Well, I gotta go. Work's calling. See you later." Crystal took off out the door, jumped in her truck and roared down the driveway. All at once she stopped and backed up. Tom looked at her in surprise when she jumped out of the truck and reached into the bed. She said, "I almost forgot the garbage for the animals. Is it all right if I just leave the bucket with you and you can bring it back later?" Tom spent a little over 30 minutes rearranging his cabinets to hold the canned tomatoes, threw the corn in the freezer, then poured his first cup of coffee and made his way to his front porch. He needed to feed his animals, then he would work in the garden. He was behind on the garden work and it seemed to be the highest priority. After a second cup of coffee, Tom made a quick breakfast and headed off for his day's work. When he got to the garden, Tom began using his hoe to weed the rows of vegetables. As he worked down the bean row, he stopped in disgust. The damn beans needed to be picked and he already knew there would be way more than he could eat before they went bad. Fuck. Tom made a quick trip to the barn for buckets to pick beans in. By the time he was done, he had 15 gallons, 1.5 bushels, of beans. Tom trudged back to his house with the beans, set them on the porch and went inside for the obligatory glass of iced tea. He came back outside and sat in a chair to begin tailing enough beans for his next couple of meals. While he worked, he tried to decide what to do with the beans. He really didn't have room to keep them cool and in good shape until Saturday when he went to the farmer's market. He perked up when he thought about yesterday. He could borrow Crystal's pressure canner and can them. He would have green beans all winter. Problem solved. Tom continued to tail and snap the beans until they were all done. He jumped into his truck and took off for Crystal's to see if he could borrow her canner. It was almost noon when he knocked on her door. Crystal came to the door dressed in shorts and a loose top, her breasts wobbling from side to side. Tom stared at her chest for a moment. He could hardly take his eyes off the little tents in her thin top. "Crystal," said Tom, "what are you doing here?" She saw where his eyes were focused and stepped back blushing. When Crystal moved, it brought Tom back to the present and he said, "Oh, sorry to bother you while you were working, Crystal, but I need to borrow your canner if I can. I was working in the garden and had to pick the beans. I have way too many to eat and I can't keep them fresh until Saturday, so I decided to can them since we were talking about it yesterday. And, if you have a book on how long to pressure them and what pressure to use, I would appreciate it, too. If you don't, I can look it up on the net." "Oh, sure. Come on in and I'll get it. I can come help if you need me to." "No, that's fine, Chris. I know you're busy and I've got most of the hard part done. I already have them cleaned and snapped and I have jars in the dishwasher being washed now. All I have to do is put them in the jars and run them through the canner. I've done it several times with Mom and last night with you, so I'm sure I can handle it." "Well, if you're sure." "Yep, I'm sure," Tom said as he picked up the canner and turned to leave. He turned his back to the screen door to push it open as he left. "Thanks again. I'll let you get back to work now. Sorry I bothered you. See ya." "Bye, Tom." Crystal watched Tom place the canner in his truck and start the engine, then she returned to her comfy chair and waiting laptop. Every few minutes throughout the afternoon she would stop and wonder how Tom was getting along. Finally, just before 6 p.m., she closed her laptop and said to herself, "That's enough. I've had it." Crystal walked into the kitchen, refilled her insulated tea glass and walked out the kitchen door and across the yard toward the path to Tom's. When she came into sight of the house she saw him sitting on his porch with a glass of iced tea. Tom smiled and stood up when Crystal stepped onto his porch. "Hi, Chris," he said. "How's the work going?" "Pardon the expression, but it's a stone-cold bitch. I'll be so glad when I'm done with this one. I decided a few minutes ago I was done for the day, so I decided to come over and see how you were doing." As she was talking, Crystal moved to the other chair on the porch and sat down. Tom looked over at her, smiled and said, "I'm about like you. I just quit for the day, also. I canned 14 quarts and 20 pints of green beans today, and I don't mind telling you I'm whipped. Kept 6 quarts fresh to cook and eat now, plus 3 of the pints, and 1 quart didn't seal so I have them to eat, also. Can I send some home with you when you go? I think I'm done canning beans for the summer. I just hope I can find something to do with the rest of the crop that I can't eat." "I'm sure you can find something. Next time, wait and pick them so you can take them to market or put a sign out on the road to sell them. In fact, you should put a sign out now for all your produce. Heck, you might not even have to go to Chattanooga. There's a lot of folks that don't grow a garden any longer or don't grow as much as they want. They might buy your produce straight from the farm. You should put a sign out about your honey, too." "Good idea. I'll do that tomorrow." Tom noticed Crystal drained her glass and said, "You want more tea?" "I just made a fresh pot." She smiled and said, "Thanks." Tom started to get up but she put her hand on his arm and said, "No, stay in your chair. I can get it." When Crystal returned she said, "Boy, those beans sure are pretty. When you get more I may have to buy some and can me some. I remember how great home canned beans used to taste. Beats those store-bought ones all hollow." The two friends visited for a few more minutes and Crystal stood before saying, "I need to go, Tom. I'm beat and I'm sure you are, too. See ya around." Tom stood and watched her as she walked across his yard and down his driveway heading for her home. After his canning day, Tom found he needed more table salt so decided to go to Drucker's since he only needed a couple of things. Besides, he needed to pick up his mail since he hadn't gotten it in a couple of days. He really needed to get rid of his post office box and put out a mailbox on the road so the rural carrier could deliver for him. This time he walked to the store again. When he stepped up on the porch the usual crew was sitting and watching the grass dry up. Tom smiled at the men and said, "Good morning." Sam stood and after the rest of the men greeted Tom said, "Morning, Tom. Haven't seen ya in a while. What can I do for you today?" "Morning, Sam. I've been busy as a one-armed paperhanger or a one-legged man at an ass-kicking contest. If I don't do something I'm going to have to hire help or cut back. I have honey and garden truck coming out my ears. I bottled honey most of last week then picked a bunch of stuff Friday, took it to the farmer's market Saturday, then Sunday Chris and I canned tomatoes. Yesterday I picked and canned green beans and ran myself out of salt and a couple of other things, so I'm here to stock back up." "Well, we can fix you right up, Tom. Come on in." Tom followed Sam into the store and began picking up the few things he needed. When he walked past the shelf the honey was on he saw there was only 2 jars left. He put his purchases down on the counter and while Sam rang them up Tom asked, "You need more honey, Sam? I see you only have 2 jars left and I've got 750 pounds or so out at the place. I need to go back to the farmer's market Saturday, and I'll take most of it to sell then." Sam thought a moment and said, "Well, I reckon I could use another half dozen jars whenever you get time to bring them in. That'll be $9.37 today, Tom." "Okay. Thanks. Here ya are, Sam. Well, I best be on my way. I have to get the mail and get back to work. See ya in a day or two." Tom worked around his place the rest of the week. He spent most of the day Friday picking vegetables to take to the market Saturday and loading the honey into his truck. Friday evening about dusk Crystal showed up again. After the greeting, she said, "What time are we leaving tomorrow, Tom?" I was planning to leave about the same time as before. I want to be set up by 7:30 or so. I didn't know you planned to go, though. Crystal looked hurt and said, "Oh. I'm sorry. I just thought we were going to go together." She turned and started back home when she felt Tom's hand on her arm. She stopped and turned back toward him. He saw a hint of tear trickles on her cheeks. "Crystal, where are you going?" "I didn't mean I didn't want you to go with me. I was just surprised. I hadn't thought about you going. I mean, I know you are busy with the manuscript and all, and I just thought you would be busy. I'd love to have you if you have time to go, but I have to warn you I expect to pay you." "Tom, I thought we went over this already." "You're not paying me. I enjoy it and I can work on my manuscript during slow times like I did before. If you insist on paying me, I'll just stay home." "Oh, okay, if you insist the pay will be the same as last week. You have to come over Sunday for lunch." Crystal smiled and moved to her chair on the porch. She said, "I can do that." "Hey, you got any tea made up?" Tom smiled and headed for the kitchen as he said, "You know I do. Be right back with it." After they chatted for a few minutes, Crystal finished her tea and stood. She said, "Well, I need to go get my beauty rest. I'll see ya in the morning." Tom reached out and grabbed her hand as she started to move. When she turned to face him, he said, "No, you don't. You look great now just as you are." "What?" "No, you don't need any beauty rest. You can't get any more beautiful." Crystal blushed and smiled. She quickly stepped forward and gave Tom a quick peck on the lips. As she stepped back, she said, "Oh, you. We need to stop and get you some glasses tomorrow." She turned then and rushed off toward her home. Crystal was ready when Tom pulled into her driveway. She had her purse and her computer in its case. She wore loose-fitting shorts and a pretty button front top underneath a straw hat. Her sunglasses were perched around the crown of the hat, resting on its brim. She didn't even wait for Tom to get out of the truck when he pulled up. She opened the door and slid into the seat, turned to him, smiled and said, "Let's get this show on the road." They pulled into the market and began setting up right on the time Tom wanted. After they were ready for business, Crystal opened her computer case and pulled some stiff-looking papers from it. She moved to the honey display and began picking up the jars and affixing a label on each. It was the label she had shown Tom the week before, except in full color. Tom picked up one of the jars and looked at it, then turned to Crystal. He said, "That is pretty snazzy, Chris, but you shouldn't have done it. How much did the labels cost?" "I'll pay you for them." "Thanks, I think they look good, too. And they didn't cost anything. I had this old adhesive-backed paper from a seminar I helped set up several years ago. We used it for name tags. I just made the labels on my computer and printed them off at home. All it cost was a little ink and I have no idea what that cost, so forget it. I wanted to do it for you and I did." "Well, thanks. Next time we'll print them at my place and I'll buy the paper." As business picked up, Tom noticed that with every vegetable sale she made, Crystal gave the purchaser a label-sized paper with his name and address on it, listing all the vegetables they could buy direct from the farm. To his surprise, the next week he actually had a half-dozen phone calls wanting to come purchase fresh produce instead of waiting for him to come to the farmer's market. As the late summer progressed, it became normal for Tom and Crystal to see each other daily. Usually Crystal came to Tom's home in the evening after their work was done. Several times she brought or wore her bathing suit and they went to the river for a swim to cool off. Finally, in early August, one day Crystal came down mid-afternoon. She was almost running and found Tom working at his computer on some army paperwork. By now, they were good enough friends they didn't knock on the other's door, they just came inside. Tom looked up when he heard the door open and smiled. Crystal almost ran to him and grabbed him in a hug. She stepped back and stood smiling as Tom asked, "Wow. What's up?" "Not that I'm not glad to see you. I just got an email from the publishing company. They and the author have accepted my final editing of that damn book and it's being scheduled for print. They even gave me a large bonus for the work. I'm free. I can take a few days off and relax before they dump another manuscript on me." can you quit for the day? I feel like a party. Sure. Let me save this and we'll get with it. Tom turned to his computer and saved his work, then looked at Crystal. He asked, well, what'll it be? I have beer, wine, some good scotch, or that all-time favorite, some good Jack Daniel's black sippin' whiskey. I feel wild today. Black Jack on the rocks if you please, sir. You go on out on the porch and I'll get it all together. Tom moved into his kitchen, filled a tub with ice, got 2 tumblers, his bottle, and a package of bar snacks, then headed for the porch. After he poured their first drink, Tom sat. They picked up their drink, clinked glasses, and smiled at each other. After the first sip, Crystal said, I expected to find you outside somewhere all sweaty and working your ass off. What were you doing on the computer? Tom smiled and leaned back in his chair. He looked off over his yard, then said, I'm sort of ending my life. Crystal gasped and started to respond. When he heard her, Tom looked over and kept on talking. He said, no, I didn't mean anything bad. Or at least I hope it isn't bad or won't be bad. I was filling out my retirement papers for the Guard. Retirement papers? I thought you still had several months left before you could retire. I do, but I have to submit the request several months in advance and give them the requested retirement date. By the time it makes its way through the bureaucracy and they approve everything, it will be near my time. I'm requesting retirement next July 1st. That will give me 20 years and 1 month of service. I just hope the honey business is all it looks like it will be, or I'll be in a world of hurt, financially. Tom, that's great. I'm so happy for you. I'm sure everything will work out just fine. She reached over and slapped him on the shoulder before continuing, but you scared the crap out of me. Don't you ever say anything like that again. Now we have something else to drink to, don't we? Well, not really. I'm just beginning the paperwork. I have a long road to hoe before it's carved in stone, then I have to wait until I'm nearly 60 for the pension. Yeah, but this is still some sort of milestone. You should be proud. Oh, I am. Believe me, I am. I just wish my parents could be here for it. Crystal reached out and gently laid her hand on Tom's forearm. She said, I know, Tom. But Mom and I are here, and we're proud of you. It turned into one of those evenings. By dusk, the 2 friends were staggering and slurring their words. Tom looked over at Crystal and slurred, hungry. Crystal giggled and said, aha. Want a pizza? Let's go get a pizza. Can't. Too drunk. Get a ticky and be in trouble. He smiled and continued, but I'm smarter than the average bear. Got a half cooked on in a freezer. We'll cook her own. Tom jumped up and headed unsteadily toward his freezer. On the way through the kitchen, he stopped and turned on the oven. When he came back with the frozen pizza from one of the big chains, he unwrapped it and placed it as carefully as a drunk can on the oven rack. After he closed the door, he leaned on the stove and carefully set the timer. He staggered back and put his arm around Crystal, then moved toward the door and the front porch once again. As he led her unsteadily toward their chairs, he said, Kay, got her cookin'. 'Bout 20 minutes and we can eat. S almost as good as fresh. I buy lots at M and bring home to freeze, then cook M later. The 2 friends demolished the entire extra-large pizza when it was cooked. Surprisingly, it wasn't ruined by the drunk cook. The next morning before daylight, Tom woke with a horrible hangover and had to piss like a racehorse. On top of that, his right arm was about to fall off, it was so badly asleep. He tried to move and heard a moan, then felt something tickling his shoulder. He jerked his arm and reached for the lamp on the bedside table. When he turned it on, he saw a naked Crystal lying beside him. Her eyes popped open in shock and she gasped out, Tom? Crystal looked around and said, what? Wow, how did we get in here? By then, Tom was already on his way to the bathroom, naked as she was. Crystal grabbed the sheet and pulled it over her. She lay there and watched the door for Tom's return. When he came back, he stopped and looked at Crystal a moment, then began walking toward the bed again. He climbed into bed beside her and turned on his side facing her. Damn lady. You're dangerous. I haven't been this drunk in ages. Crystal blushed and started to roll away when Tom reached out to hold her. You know they say booze doesn't cause you to do things, it just lowers your inhibitions and lets you do some things you really wanted to do. I've wanted to. No, that's the wrong way to say it. Chris, I've fallen in love with you and was too damn scared to tell you. I'm glad we got past, no, I mean, oh, hell, I don't know what I mean. Just, I'm sorry if you're upset here. Crystal pulled from his arms and rushed from the room. Tom felt as if he had just blown it big time. He got up to follow her and try to repair the damage when he heard her in the bathroom throwing up. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment trying to decide what to do, then carefully opened the bathroom door. There was a door from his bedroom and from the living area to the bathroom, and moved carefully into the room. He found a clean wash rag and wetted it with cool water. When Crystal raised her head, he helped her stand and gently wiped her face with the clean rag. Crystal began crying and without thinking they moved together in a gentle hug. After a few moments she pushed away from him and wiped her face. She looked down at their nakedness and smiled. She was dry and he wasn't hard. Through her sniffles she said, "You don't know how much I have wanted to be in bed with you, Tom, but this wasn't how I imagined it would be. I wanted the moon. You know, every woman's dream? I wanted the special moment, I wanted to stare soulfully into your eyes and do the romantic key. Sing thing, then I get myself and you drunk and we just hop into bed like I don't know what." Tom hugged Crystal again and gently rubbed her back. He said, "Yeah, I think I know, but, Chris, I don't think we did anything. I mean, my hair's not matted and, you don't look like you've been, you doesn't look as if we've had sex. I mean, we were pretty wasted and I think all we did is get naked and crawl into bed here." Crystal almost cried as she moaned out, "But I want to do it. I love you too, and I just wanted it to be so perfect if we got to that point. Look, it's a little after 4:30. Let's just forget this ever happened. Come on, honey. I can take you home if you want, or we can just go back to bed and get some sleep and figure this out tomorrow. Well, I guess later today. When we get up for good." Chris stood without moving, just letting Tom hold her. Finally Tom said, "Chris, honey?" She just continued to stand gently hugging him. Finally, he gently led her back to bed. He covered her with the sheet when she was fully reclined and crawled back into bed on his side. They moved together and lay on their sides, him spooning her from behind. He put his hand on her shoulder and started to move down to her breasts, then stopped. Finally, he moved his hand down and placed it on her abdomen and pulled her gently to him. Crystal moaned and grabbed his hand. She moved it up until he cupped her breast before she sighed and lay there gently pressing his hand to her breast. To Tom's surprise, they went to sleep. In the past, he had been unable to sleep spooning a woman. He needed his space. He was a sprawler when he slept. Shortly after 9 a.m. the next morning, Tom and Chris were awakened by someone banging on his door calling his name. He almost fell out of bed when he tried to get up. His head was throbbing and his mouth felt horrible. He stumbled around trying to put yesterday's pants on so he could answer the door. Finally he got both legs in the correct leg hole and he staggered toward the front door while fastening his pants. When Tom opened the door he found a frantic Patricia standing there. Before he could say anything she began talking. "Tom, I can't find Crystal. Have you seen her? She called me yesterday and told me she had finally completed her work on the last manuscript she was assigned and was going out to party with a friend. I tried calling her earlier this morning and she didn't answer. I wanted to come down and celebrate with her, but when I got to her house she wasn't there and her truck was. I'm worried sick about her. This just isn't like her." As she was talking, Pat pushed past Tom into his house. He followed, trying to keep up with her and formulate an answer to the obviously frantic woman. About that time a very disheveled Crystal came out of Tom's room wearing one of his old shirts. Why do women always wear their man's shirt and why do they look so damn sexy when they do? As she entered the living room Chris said, "Tom, what's all the noise, Moem?" "Oh, God. Shit, this morning just keeps getting better and better." She turned and rushed back into the bedroom. Pat looked up at Tom and said, "Well, I guess you know where she is." You both look like warmed over shit, too, and don't smell much better. Get your ass in there and clean up while I put on some coffee. Pat. I can explain. Oh, can it, Tom? I can see. You're both adults here. I suppose I was just being a panicky mom. If she had told me she was going out with you, I wouldn't have been worried. Pat, nothing happened here. I mean we, just slept together. And oh, I mean all we did was sleep. Pat smiled and said, okay, if you say so. Now go. Tom turned and went to the now closed bedroom door. He knocked and said, Chris? Chris, you decent? When he got no answer, he carefully opened the door, then heard the shower running. He completely and fully opened the door, then entered his room. All Crystal's clothes from yesterday were gone. He was digging out clean clothes for himself when he heard the shower stop. Shortly, Chris opened the door and looked at Tom. She gave him a sick smile and said, shower's open, hurry and clean up so you can face the music with me. Tom grimaced and said, I've already faced some of it. She's making coffee now. I'll be there in a few minutes. K. Tom took a fast shower and ran his razor over the stubble as he was doing it. Like many servicemen, he had learned to shave in the shower using regular soap, and now did it out of habit. Freshly cleansed and dressed in baggy shorts and shirt, he was almost ready to face the day. He took a deep breath and slowly opened the door into the living area to face the music. Why the hell did he feel like a teenager caught with his hands in his sweetie's bra? Damn it, he was a 37-year-old army officer and shouldn't feel like this, especially when he was in the privacy of his own home. Tom was happy to find Pat and Crystal gone. He heaved a sigh of relief and poured a mug of coffee. He thought about sitting at the table to drink it as he was still walking impaired, but decided he really needed the peace of his front porch. He shambled toward the door. When he opened the door expecting solitude, he found two smiling women waiting on him. Pat leaned toward Chris and whispered something to her, then they both giggled. Fuck, Tom thought. He shambled toward the women and took one of the two remaining chairs. After he was seated, Pat turned to him and said, well, what do you have to say for yourself, young man? Tom closed his eyes for a moment and thought, crap, this is going to be worse than I thought. He took a breath and said, look, I'm sorry here. We had a little, no a lot, too much to drink and somehow ended up sleeping together. Neither of us knows how we managed to do it, but... He stopped when Pat broke out in a belly laugh and Chris giggled. While Tom was still trying to think about what was going on, Pat said, oh, I think at your age you know how you managed to do it. Now, what do you have to say for yourself here? When she saw the stricken look on Tom's face, Crystal took pity on him and laid her hand on her mother's forearm before she said, Mom, that's enough. You shouldn't fuck with a hungover drunk like that. You've had your fun, now leave us alone. Oh, alright, but an opportunity like this doesn't come along very often. I really think you should let me enjoy it longer. Pat turned to face Tom and continued, Tom, it's fine. I'm glad you finally woke and smelled the roses, as it were. That girl of mine has been head over heels in love with you for months, here. I was getting tired of listening to her complain about how you kept missing the signals. As Crystal yelled, Moem, Tom said, what? Pat looked at Crystal and said, Mom, what? It's what you've told me now for weeks. Haven't you told Tom? Well, yes, we did discuss that earlier this morning, but you don't need to tell the world all my secrets. Tom reached out and took her hand. Crystal stopped talking and turned to look at him. He said, it's okay, honey. I felt the same way, but I just couldn't find the right time to say anything. He got up and went into the house, leaving two perplexed women on the porch. When he came back, he had the coffee pot on one hand and a small box in the other. He set the coffee pot down and opened the box. He pulled a ring out and looked down at a weeping woman. He held the ring out and said, I have been looking for just the right time to ask this question but couldn't find it, so I suppose I'll just ask now. Crystal Dawson, will you marry me? Pat said, Humph, it's about time. At the same time, Crystal jumped from her chair and hugged Tom as she said, yes. Oh, yes. She held her left hand out for him to place the ring on her finger. It was slightly too large, but fit well enough she could wear it for a short time. Pat smiled and said, "Well now, I'm glad that's taken care of finally. Now, how about some breakfast, then I'll tell you my news." Pat left the two lovers on the porch and went into the house to see if Tom had enough for her to cook or if she needed to go back to Crystal's house. She found plenty and had the meal half prepared before Tom and Crystal came into the room. As they were eating, Tom remembered Pat's last statement and asked her what her news was. Pat smiled and said, "My company has been bought out. They are laying off many of the personnel and giving them a great severance package. Since I'm old enough now to get Social Security, I've decided to take the package, file for my Social Security and move back here to retire. This is a great thing for all of us. You kids have this nice place and I can move back into my house after the wedding." Tom said, "Well, congratulations, Pat. I know how you must feel. I was working on my retirement application yesterday when Chris came down and accosted me." Chris slapped him on the shoulder and said, "Tom, I did no such thing, I just came down and offered to have a drink with you to celebrate my completing the book." Tom smiled and said, "Whatever. I notice you managed to get me into bed, somehow. I think that amounts to accosting someone." Thankfully, everyone laughed. Then the conversation turned to other things such as planning a wedding, retirement, moves, and so forth. After the wedding, Tom and Crystal continued as before in their working lives. He successfully retired from the reserves without another deployment and continued working with his bees and small truck garden. She continued editing manuscripts. In between, they managed to have 2 children, a boy and girl, who grew up to follow in their parents' footsteps. The boy seemed to have been born to be a soldier and the girl excelled in English, as had her mother.